Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you today on this Tuesday at this time. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I really enjoyed reading this book. So, couple things up front, of course, like, share, subscribe, make sure more people see this. We are streaming on the Millennials platform. We're also streaming on Everything Else with Jay because this conversation kind of spans both. Like, it could go to Everything Else with Jay, but also Gemma is, a multi-time guest and a good friend. And also, as we'll talk about, she doesn't use like counterinsurgency frameworks within her book, but there's ways that this conversation, I think, dovetails with some of the stuff that we've done in terms of those conversations as well. And so yeah, so looking forward to this. For folks who don't know, Gemma is, of course, the author of The Aesthetic Character of Blackness, which is now out in the world. We don't have to say that as a soon to come book anymore. It's on Duke University Press. You can also download it for free. It's open access. Some people had some issues downloading it. It seems like it works on some browsers and not on others, so try them. But the link is in the show description for that. She is also a frequent contributor to the podcast Sad Francisco, which she will be repping heavily today, and an organizer in San Francisco. So, Gemma, it's good to be with you again. Looking forward to this conversation.
Hey, I am repping.
You are. You
I
got
don't
the
know how
hat
good my
and the
camera
shirt.
is. And the shirt. I know I'm very, very branded up.
Yeah, we need to. It. All I know is that we need to at some point finally get millennials merch because we've been doing this for
Yeah.
8 years and we still don't have anything. So
I'm
it's
surprised that
just
doesn't exist. Yeah.
it's just too intimidating every time I think about it. I'm like, I don't know where to even start with this. All right. So before we get going though, you wanted to plug a mutual aid effort today, which you've done, I think, every time that you've been on, which is wonderful. So do you want to say a little bit about this group, and I can share their Chuffed page, which the link for this is in the show description as well.
Yeah, this is Dahun Mutual Aid Collective. Dahnun, you can see it, Mutual Aid Collective. It's run by Ghazawis and both in occupied Gaza, and then it's also run by folks outside, of course, because it's hard to get money inside. And they have been doing really incredible work since the beginning of the genocide. And, it goes right to people. It's, I'm not someone who thinks like, oh, we have to be so worried about getting scammed or these kinds of things. But, for people that do have that skepticism, whatever, this is all their work. It's really incredible, important, immediate mutual aid work that sustains folks in Gaza. And it's something we can do, especially this for those that celebrate holiday season where, it feels increasingly empty to buy things, which maybe it always did. And it's a really great way to support folks in Gaza and organizers elsewhere that are involved in it that are doing some incredible work. And yeah, that's please donate and share. You can always repost or retweet or re up on your social media. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thank you for doing that. Um, so I really like the way that you start this book out, and I think it's a good place for us to start this
Sure.
conversation. So you start with Oakland post George Floyd, right? So summer of 2020. Um, and like you lay this out in the preface, which is called Black Art Against Black People. And this section actually reminded me quite a bit of some of Two Black's reflections. I think he writes some of it in the book Laundering Black Rage, along with Rasul Moat. They co-authored that. But Two Black specifically was, he's a poet, right? And so he's been in the art scene in Indianapolis. And I remember him noticing and talking about how much, there were kind of like these city gigs that were coming up
Yeah.
and a lot of money, not a lot of money, but money being channeled to Black artists, right, around him, and seeing the way that even sometimes producing like artwork that, you know, has a revolutionary aesthetic to it and all of this, which that's a maybe a contradiction in terms, but we'll talk about that. But um basically, you know, this is one of the things that drove him to want to write Laundering Black Rage, right? It's like, what, you know, what are the mechanisms that are going on here? Um, and so you writing about the same kind of thing, you know, thinking about it in also really related to real estate, which I thought was really interesting. And that's a big piece of your book is kind of um, the role of like speculation and all of this
Mhm.
and and you know buildings and all of this. But you know, I remember Two Black kind of reflecting upon it as both, you know, confusing and diffusing in certain ways, right? Like it's sort of politically confusing for folks, but also diffusing people, like people who might be involved in, you know, resistance or, you know, protests or organizing, like now are doing these art gigs and stuff like that. So say a
Mhm.
little bit about what you saw in Oakland in that moment
Sure.
that relates to the theme of this book.
Sure. That's a great place to start. It's kind of where the to me the book starts, even though it's not where my research started. My research, it goes back to grad school, and it is more the historical parts you see in the book, but the contemporary was very much part of being an artist, or reluctantly, increasingly reluctantly being an artist. And I'll show a picture of the physical book, which you said is available. I don't want my background to blur it out. On yeah, there's a multiple austerity. You have to cross brand. So there was actually, I don't know if we can. I think you're probably allowed to put the pictures if you're able to. Sorry, we didn't talk about this because I took them. They're not. They
Yeah,
were taken
I
during
can
the
pull those
photography.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, that might help folks, just because this is the most visual part of the book, I think, for the most part. And what I noticed is immediately following, so Oakland in particular, very similar to a lot of other cities across the United States, was subject to these really, frankly, like kind of autonomous moments of revolt. On, I want to say, like, maybe it was May 28th. I forget what I say in the book, 29th. And this was obviously following the state murder of George Floyd, and it not long after, you see this, some of these photos are taken in, I want to say, September, but I noticed it actually in June, so probably a few days after, maybe a week after this night where, very famous, there's a lot, probably footage online, I've never really checked, but like people broke into car dealerships and took cars, and it was very much a big, depending, moment of revolt. And I think, obviously a lot of these got mischaracterized, or not mischaracterized, but characterized as riots, whatever we want to think about the, we don't have like riot respectability politics, I guess. But I think there was an obvious political exhaustion that I also talk about, and the product of kind of what was specifically happening in downtown Oakland, which we can go into. But in June, after this night, which I think, if you're in a city, I'm sure this was true of Philly, that had kind of one of these nights of revolt, or perhaps extended periods of revolt, as is the case with Oakland, it lasted more than a few days. You started to see a lot of banks and businesses downtown, what would normally have been, for example, like I think of during Occupy, I've lived here this long and longer, they would put plywood over their windows, so that it was like, we expect people to smash our windows. We're Citibank, or we're, in the kit you showed the picture, a yoga studio in downtown, right? Or we're Starbucks, or some major corporate chain, kind of going back to the WTO, maybe as a sort of immediate, relatively immediate moment, being, in the last 30 years. And so they would cover them with plywood. But what I noticed this time, and it's the first time I've noticed it, I'm not, it's possible it happened during Occupy, but I don't remember that being the case, is that a lot of these businesses, from multinational banks to presumably local, smaller gentrification businesses like a yoga studio, to what I was particularly focused on, the empty, voluminous, empty real estate that occupies downtown Oakland. They were putting plywood, but it was covered with art, I mean, for lack of a better word, and we could call it black art, and we can talk about what, maybe we'll talk about this too. I know you all did like forgeries of memory and meaning, and like Cedric Robbins, like kind of like talking about what constitutes black film or what constitutes black art. And I could also talk about it in the context of the way the book is defining black art to an extent that it gives it a positive definition. But you saw all these kinds of images, a lot of which adopted the sort of radical, or at least, fairly radical in the case of this defund one, and aesthetics of like graffiti, of Black cultural imagery, particularly local stuff. We could talk exhaustively about I would actually call it kind of artification, but we could also say representation of the Black Panthers in the Bay and how that's kind of used too, right? So you see like a Black Panther holding a BLM flag as if to be like, this connects the history of the Black Panthers in, 60s, 70s to this moment right now, right? That's kind of, I mean, someone got into an argument with me about one of the editors if that was a jaguar, and I was like, well, actually Panthers can have anyway. I mean, it would seem kind of random. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's true. I remember that. Panthers have spots. They're just, they're hard to see.
Yes, exactly. That was like one of those pointing your head memes, like wake, so there, that felt like a very, in what I think you use the word, you're talking about Too Black, talking about it being confusing or diffusing. It's like, you saw this if you were just a passerby, and that's how I kind of tried to approach it, because when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is weird. And then, I was like, okay, so what's happening an attempt at kind of, and you saw people try this in 2020. I mean, maybe kind of famously in Portland, for example, of all places. I unfortunately grew up in Portland. We share the Pacific Northwest heritage. And, kind of occupying. Like, is this going to be people occupying? And we could problematize that word, but occupying an area, is it people trying to come up with a kind of protest zone, or leaving aside the merits of that or not? That's what I kind of thought was happening, but there were no people. It was just the murals. It was like after a while there were projects that began, and usually they were in different parts of the Bay. I don't want to say these things weren't happening, as I referred to in the beginning of the first page of the book, but there was essentially this depopulated part of downtown that had all these murals, kind of, I would say, like an excessive amount relative to the people you saw. It was like there were more murals and images of Black people than there were of actual Black people. And that struck me as a very immediate way to understand this kind of moment, and both a reaction to this moment, but also kind of what had always been happening and what provoked this, to also kind of think of it in those complex terms, perhaps dialectical or negatively dialectical, depending on how we want to look at it. Like, is that in a way, the plywood was obviously meant to block people from breaking the glass, but then the question was kind of like, why do they need the images? And the images were kind of, these are not targeting people's, for lack of a better word, kind of material capacities, like whether that be a kind of project of folks going out at night and smashing the glass of banks or whatever, which a lot of, say, anarchist folks do, and others, autonomous folks. But it was like, this is obviously meant to target your, for lack of a better word, kind of imaginative space, right? Like, this is meant to be like, oh, this space has been, it was an acknowledgement that the space has been transformed, but it was acknowledgement that the space has been transformed only to reimpose the reason it needed to be transformed in the first place. And it did so through the kind of, I wouldn't even just call it, and this is something the book also pushes against a lot, just the appearance or simulacrum of Black art. It was doing it in a very targeted, I think, kind of deeper way that is, and I talk about this a little bit, and I think it sounds like in the other book, Too Black gets at this, of like materially funded way of getting at Black art. So to the extent that, like a lot of the US, but particularly let's say the Bay Area, has an extensive investment in funding Black art, not to suggest that that's any kind of radical gesture, is debatable, right? There's not a lot of money available for Black artists. So the fact that a great amount of city money, and also through corporations, and it's something I talk a little bit about, but don't exclusively want to talk about, as like institutional funding, which I think could also go to the counterinsurgents angle of it, right? And we'll probably talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about that again when we talk about the last chapter. But I thought ultimately there were Black artists and artists who make Black art and again, how can one distinguish, especially with this representative kind of project, who decided this was a good idea? And whether that means it was a good idea, like I'm getting money, I'm, getting a little bit of money, kind of like you just referred to, or they thought, hell yeah, this is in the spirit of this moment of 2020. And it says a lot that there is both this kind of structural problem of, I don't quite frame it this way, but I'll speak in this way just for a moment, using Black art, because I don't think this opposes the essence of what Black art is, but using Black art in a way to neutralize, and you could use the words confuse, delude, water down the kind of projects, and I would say ultimately life of Black people, right? So it is a very overt moment of where Black art is being used to quite literally hold Black people back. Like, before you throw that whatever chair, no, it's not a chair, but like if you throw that rock or that brick, to use the kind of Stonewall chronotrope, think of, wait, you can't throw a brick through a Black Panther. That's our history. That's our lineage. You can't throw. I think the interesting one is you also saw the defund police, which is like very much in a style of graffiti. Down the street, I don't think this ended up in the book. There was also this luxury condo that had very bespoke graffiti. I don't know if we'll get more of it. Yeah, like, I mean, the We Can't Breathe, that might have been done by a person that night. It's hard to tell, or someone who came by. And it's also that also kind of adds to that confusion argument that I think I kind of embrace in the book, and that I'm like, well, we don't actually need to tease out the entirety of the confusion, because this could have been done that after that night, because obviously the plywood wasn't up the night it happened. I don't think so. But the effect is very similar, that it can be turned into this kind of depopulating project. And that's a good example of graffiti. Yeah. So it was like, what does it mean? And even if that's someone who's a local graffiti artist, it's kind of like, what does it mean that they're like, oh, and there's an acknowledgement in that gesture that this is as far as we can go. We can have a surface to make our representations on. In other words, if we were to go back to the 19th century, and we'll probably talk about this, right, we can see ourselves reflected in the world that is annihilating us. And I think that's what I would define as something like Black art, right? Like, as we can see ourselves reflected. And that goes back a long time to the, I think someone like Adorno would say the reflective conception of an artwork that goes back to the 19th century in Europe. I don't think it's not something Black people don't have, because we have a kind of different, for lack of a better word, sort of cultural origin than non-Black people in the West. It's like we very much see this right there in the kind of material project of luxury real estate development, which preceded the George Floyd night, unquestionably led up to it, right? You have a city that, Oakland and San Francisco, and the Bay in general, that is like antagonizing and attacking Black folks and displacing them, which we should call a form of attack and violence, for the expense of vacant real estate property, which is for the production of real estate values, right? Like, to speculate the land. I don't know if we could talk more about speculation, but maybe kind of briefly before I go on and on and on, is I think we can see the kind of joining point of two forms of speculation, which is the speculation of capital that is in, and I'm sure other people live in other cities, especially like Philly, you see this, I'm sure, and tons of luxury condos. You can see the speculative value or the speculative production of vacant real estate and the speculative imagination of so-called Black art right against that surface, right? One is about protecting that space of value that loses a value to a great extent, especially if it happens more often. People break all the glass. And then you see something that attains its value from producing, for lack of a better word, Black people's reflection in the glass, right? So that was, to me, like a really overt, one could even say material point of overlap, or kind of like a joining point for these two, what people might think of superficially as, or not even superficially, might just think of even historically as opposed projects, right? And that they might go, oh, well, Black art has never been about or centered or caused the extermination of Black life. But I think that is something that made me realize, oh no, that's not actually true. And it's not just this moment, this has happened before.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the historical background, because I think it's really it's really interesting. I mean, this is one of the things I really enjoy about the book is that um I think there was something about that 2020 moment that felt like quite new in some ways in terms of the ways that representations were being, you know, I think maybe it was just the capacity that they had to like have have Amazon Prime send out like solidarity to black people
Mhm.
and like, like these kind of things like
Spaghettios.
yeah. Um but you know, so I think there can be a way like we want to go back and that is something that like Two Black and Russell Mulat do in their book as well is to like kind of like okay like let's go back and think about this. But they're not doing it so much from art and aesthetic, right? In the same way that you are. Um and we'll go there in a second because I do want to go to kind of Frederick Douglass next. But one of the things that I really appreciated, you kind of, laid it all out there. But in that preface, you're really talking about how, like, one of the things you write is quite deceptively, these murals were not for us; they were against us. They were for the protection of empty buildings that we could never live in. They were banks that flourished from making our communities, homes, and lives unlivable, stores that we, like Banco Brown, could never shop in without being followed, harassed, arrested, murdered. These Black representations expressed an affliction that cohabitated with Oakland's arting. Our resounding and our imaging increasingly liberate the aesthetic, they do not liberate us. And there's other points where you kind of talk about this of like just this notion of that yeah it defends like the value of the space, and it's a space that black people can't can't populate, right?
Mhm.
Um and interestingly too, I think at some point in the book too, you kind of talk about the figure of the black artist, right, as
Mhm.
also someone who maybe could populate that space as an individual, right?
Yeah.
Like, if we're talking about somebody who's super successful, right? But that's not something that's going to, allow the masses of black people to benefit from in any kind of way. Um, well, let's go back because I really do want to talk about the Frederick Douglass thing. Well,
Sure.
before we get that, I do have one other question. So
Mm.
I'm interested in when this project started for you. Like, was it inspired? Like, I know you wrote that preface, but was it
Mhm.
inspired by that moment, or was it something you were already working on, and it just kind of took another level of analysis as you kind of experienced that moment in Oakland? And I know you also write in the book about being a musician and your experiences with that over time. So I'm just curious, like how much, like when it started, kind of, and like how it refined over time.
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, it was definitely closer to the latter. I had some of the research done about some of this, like the chapter on George W. Johnson. I had some analysis of, which we could also talk about how that relates to Frederick Douglass, maybe too. I had, I think, yeah, I definitely had written a version of the Ma Rainey chapter, which I think you have some questions about later too. And there were probably some version of these before 2020, but the sort of framing, and they all got completely rewritten, I'll say that. But some of the framing really comes from a contemporary, or at the time, contemporary moment of 2020 and kind of after. I mean, in some ways we're still in that moment. Maybe that's also something to discuss is like, are we still in that moment, or how are we still in that moment? So it came from that. And then it also came from a long time before any of that stuff was written in, gosh, I mean, or before grad school, but also especially in grad school, living in San Francisco and trying to be an artist, and specifically a black artist, specifically really being like, claiming that mantle and being like, when, can we develop spaces, collectives of black artists that make black art, which, was never interested in. This is why I also kind of don't do that in the book, a positive definition of the content of the art, but was about black art as a project on some level that was for Black people. And that for is, of course, in some ways also as you read in that line a bit ago, the complexity and point of contestation for the book now. But what I found as a, I'm not gonna say successful, but as a Black artist in the Bay, although to the extent that you could be a successful artist in the Bay, I suppose it's not New York, it's not LA. Usually people who are successful move to those cities, or, maybe Europe, although I don't think that'll happen anymore. Uh, for a lot of reasons. Uh, so I found that, it's also helpful to contextualize. This is not in the book, I don't think, in terms of in a broad way, but I'm sure you've had people talk about it. It was kind of this is over 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. This is also kind of the Obama moment. It's the Beyonce moment, I would say, was a big part of it, right? So it really is this moment where Black people broadly, maybe in response to the 2008 financial crisis slash Obama, are like brought to be, or are made to be reinvested in capitalism in a way that perhaps they would less have been, had the kind of lessons of 2008 been sat with, or something like that, in a broader way. So you see, I felt, or I saw a lot of people who, I'd approach other Black artists, people I worked with in some cases, or took kind of classes with. I took a lot of classes in different mediums and a lot of music. I did a lot of experimental music and like computer music. Yeah, there's a long history of experimental music in the Bay, and I kind of always wanted to form something like that, like like a collective of Black experimental musicians. But what I found is that there was kind of this very ever-present austerity logic that was kind of framing the opposite, right? Like, so people had this very like, fuck you, pay me, your best revenge is your paper, all these kinds of like sort of sloganized things that people maybe now think of that moment. I think people are, especially younger people, are probably more critical of those. But that was very much the milieu in which I came up as a Black artist. And it was very frustrating to talk to other Black artists who are also Black people and be like, hey, we should do something for this, community that's being displaced. And it was like, well, that's not really, you're not getting paid to do that. And no one is going to see it who's in the art world. You're not going to get any career progress from it. That's okay, if that's the only way you need to make a check, there's I can on some level be like, that's fine, you make art for money. The thing I found frustrating, even more frustrating than that, was people Black artists taking gigs for massive corporations, particularly tech corporations, because this is also the, 2010s, 2011, 2012, 2015, etc. The second tech boom, which has been, I think, probably more devastating to the Bay Area than the first tech boom. And a lot of Black artists, a lot of whom were transplants, but some of whom grew up here, there's different kinds of, I would say, like, kind of ignorance around tech amongst Black artists. I kind of found that to be the case. Some would be people here that had weirdly grown up here and never sort of understood or been exposed to tech. It was kind of just like operated in a different part of the city than them. Maybe the same way like Wall Street would for people in New York. Like, it just they didn't really understand what it was. And then I think there were also a lot of transplants who more insidiously probably were like, oh, I don't care. I'm not going to live here forever. I'm trying to make it. I'm going to move to New York or LA to have an art career. And so they would take any gig, any corporation, any tech company, threw at them, and like, to make murals in the lobby of like Twitter or Instagram or one of these corporations, like massive surveillance corporations that are so, now I think, again, people are more aware of this, that were the reasons we had, more and more Black people being displaced from the Bay Area, not just San Francisco, but, particularly San Francisco, but also Oakland. I mean, Oakland experienced, I think, way more than the first .com boom, a really dramatic force of displacement and gentrification and financialization, all these things that really destroyed a lot more Black life. And I kind of allude to that in the beginning of the book. And so it was also funny. I've always lived in San Francisco. I've never lived in Oakland, but I would have to come at other Black artists who lived in Oakland for doing this. And I was like, you can hate, because a lot of their complaints would be like, there's no Black people in San Francisco. And I was like, well, what do you think that is? I mean, not that there are none. I mean, I would push against that, but I get it. There's a lot less. And that happened in the 90s under Willie Brown and under the first .com boom. So like, I would say that to them, like, you doing a mural for Uber or whatever, one of those companies, you're helping turn Oakland, which you view as this kind of Black cultural mecca that made you move here and gentrify it from whatever, college, Wesleyan, or I don't know where, whatever. you're taking part in the very kind of thing you're criticizing. But I think because there was this kind of, to pick on the murals earlier, this kind of memorialized version of Blackness in Oakland, particularly in the Black Panthers, but also that kind of, and maybe we'll talk about it in the end when we talk about the last chapter, kind of the Afrocentric moment, which I think of as totally counterinsurgent, if you want to use the word counterinsurgency, and cultural nationalist moment, which I think is also a big point of criticism. We could talk about that when we talk about Baraka. Because there was that kind of long enduring history, people didn't really think other Black people. It was almost like they didn't think there were still Black people. It kind of felt like there is Black art, there are not Black people. In other words, I'm accountable to a kind of Black art, perpetuating it as a Black artist, but I'm not really accountable to the Black people who live here. And I was like, no, this is what's happening to the Black people. They're getting priced out of apartments so landlords can put people from Twitter in there who pay 3 times the rent or whatever. And no one, and so that created a lot of the context that we started this with 2020. It was like, of course, a lot of people were fucking pissed that this, all these mega corporations, including, of course, banks and all the usual suspects, were used to turn Oakland into a real estate project, a get-rich-quick scheme, a place totally significantly more depopulated of Black folks. And I think Black artists played a role in that, in at least those 2 ways. One, that they didn't really want to do anything to fight gentrification directly. And I have a friend who lived here in the 90s and got into fights with people around that with San Francisco. And they didn't want to do anything to stop it. But the fact that they also want to do stuff to aid it is where I really was like, this is where it's, so I was very disillusioned with that. And eventually it just was not possible to form a Black arts collective. I realized that kind of had those politics that were actually a little more in line with a lot of the more radical Black arts organizations in the 60s. So that's how it kind of came out of that. And yeah, I could talk about, there's a lot of citation or paraphrasing of the kinds of excuses and this idea, which I think is maybe still exists, of being paid in exposure. And a lot of Black artists were like, oh, Twitter's not going to pay me much, or this company, this startup, for example, which is also part of gentrification, is not going to pay me much, but they're paying me an exposure. They're going to, put me on their website, or I'll be able to perform in front of these people, or networking. It's a good networking opportunity. And it's like, fuck your networking. It's not more important. But it says a lot that was more important to them than a kind of mythic Black people that I guess don't exist in them, ironically, in their very espousal of a kind of populated Black art, sometimes visually, sometimes representationally, art that, represented Black people. So that's kind of where it came from in a very basic way. And the more esoteric ideas around Blackness and things started to cohere around that very real experience, if you like, for that, kind of regardless of the content of a lot of this art, this was happening across that the form.
Oh, that's really interesting. So let's see. So yeah, so let's go back. Let's talk about Frederick Douglass, who's interesting, like, because I had never thought of Frederick Douglass as an artist, right? For one thing, or musician, right? Because you're talking in specific to him related to music too, and there's a lot of reasons it's interesting. I mean, for one reason, yeah, obviously you're going way back. So it's not like a kind of, okay, let's trace the lineage of this from, through the 20th century or through the, you do get to you do look at, in particular, the Harlem Renaissance and the Black arts movement, which we'll get to later on, as well as some other, kind of in between moments. But, here you're really grappling with, we have to deal with slavery. We have to deal with, manumission, which I like that you use that term as opposed to, abolition, right? And the development of early commercial spaces for Black artists and musicians, right? And this coming, of course, on the heels of like white minstrelsy, right, to a degree as well, or actually, kind of going on in the same eras in certain ways. And it takes us out of the question of kind of like, which I've asked this question before of folks, and it's not a very good question, of like, why don't we have good protest songs anymore, right? Like, or what, or like what happened to us, right? Like, why can't we produce Curtis Mayfield's today, right? Like
Mm.
these sort of questions, right? And I think, when I've asked those questions, people often give me the kind of like, well, the movements and the politics and the organizations that exist in an era, like they produce the Curtis Mayfields, right? So it's like it's the struggles and it's the material
Mhm.
conditions and it's the discussions that are going on at the time, right, that produce something like that. And I think that is interesting, and I think there's something to that as well. Um, but you're kind of looking at, you know, the beginning of you're also grappling with new forms of like even again the speculation, right? Of like, okay, if slavery, if chattel slavery is no longer going to be, the economic way that we extract from black folks, like
Mm.
what are some of the new ways that that's
Yeah.
going to work? Um so yeah, let's start with Douglas. And I'm just interested in you talking kind of about what first, like what you're talking about with Douglas, so people know the context of, what
Sure.
among Douglas's work you're referencing, but some of those dynamics that you're looking at in that very early period.
Yeah, so it's also helpful too in light of your earlier question is like how the book started. And so I actually in grad school was looking at a lot of the origins of the beginning of the recording of black music and black people. And again, there can be argued to be a kind of split between those, but also a lot of points of overlap. And so Frederick Douglass, it as I kind of became more invested in like, okay, looking purely at in simple terms, kind of like the first records, if you will, the wax cylinders, which is what I talk about in the next chapter, of black musicians or singers or different kinds of performers. I was like, well, what about before that? Like what occasions recording? And of course, I had kind of the historical genealogy of like the phonograph, and you can look at similar technologies and I talk about that a little bit. But then I also thought kind of like, well, what about black music then? Is it just the case that black music incidentally gets caught up in the phonograph? And it's, that would be one argument that people kind of make when they're like, oh, a technology is neutral. It's just what people do with it or what people, let's say, capture in the case of that. But the more I looked into the early writings on black music, which I think there is a book, I'm forgetting the name of it, by John Cruz that I cite a couple times that talks about it as beginning in Frederick Douglass's writing. And that really, for the most part, in the US, but this kind of branches out to the broader, slave owning and to some manumitted world, because we could say like Britain, and countries that manumitted their slaves a bit earlier. But you have a question later about Brazil too, which obviously in manumits, and I don't want to say I'm not a scholar of Brazilian slavery, so I can talk about it a little bit, but it manumits much later than the U.S. or somewhat later. So Frederick Douglass was for me interesting because he's such a seminal figure in how black music becomes a cultural object, how it becomes black music, honestly. Because, before that, to a greater degree, particularly from the perspective of white people, and you could even in a lot of cases say the black bourgeoisie, which did exist, right? Even go back to the 18th century, black the primary musical representation of black folks you saw, or the kind of two predominant ones, one was the broadly dehumanizing structure of the minstrel stage, right, which again was white artists in blackface, which was something people knew. A lot of the posters, and I think I put one in here, there's a bunch in books like Eric Lott's Love and Theft has this poster, there's a bunch of other, where it shows the white artists and then it shows their black personas, right? So you get this, it, as a person in the 19th century going to one of these shows, let's say the early 19th century, you get this depiction that it's not necessarily, for some it may be, but it's not necessarily that these are real black people. Quite to the opposite, it's kind of like, this is what we can do to black people. It's kind of an extension of the logic of mastery, to use that, I suppose, like the term from Saidiya Hartman, that it's a way of liberating mastery. I talk about it, right? Like, so the minstrel stage is a way, again, we often, I think, as you highlighted why I use the word manumission, we mischaracterize this moment leading up to the 1860s as emancipation or abolition. And I think what actually happens is the forms of domination that are sealed inside the theoretically unique property form of the enslaved are actually liberated, right? And for example, you've had a lot about prisons on the show, so that's an obvious example, right? Where more and more people are subject to these forced labor regimes that were, to a degree, unique. I mean, they exist in other places, but unique to this chattel slavery institution. And so that, I think that the kind of liberation of mastery, again, imaginatively so, of the minstrel stage, where white people who are, more closely you could kind of say like sort of middle class. There are some there are a lot of working class white people for sure, especially as it goes on, who can attend the minstrel stage, but who could themselves never own slaves, right? Never afford to own slaves, can partake in this kind of, and someone like Saidiya Hartman talks about this in Scenes of Subjection, I think, can take part in this kind of not just effective, but kind of, as I talk about it aesthetically, imaginative reproduction of mastery. And so the question from the minstrel stage is kind of also like, well, if there is this imaginative reproduction going on, what is it producing? What is it, what is mastery if it's just in your head, or something like that? Not that to speak, complicate the imagination as just in our heads, but and so that is what is a very predominant form of music. And, is it Black music? Technically, no. A lot of the, instrumentation and things are taken from, Irish folk musics and other sort of European folk musics. It does use things like the banjo and instruments that have their origins in Africa and with African, enslaved African folks in the New World. But it's very clearly the other side of it you have is the burgeoning abolitionist perspective, which is, to the extent that it's looking at sound, is looking at the sounds of the enslaved, right? And it's mostly looking at them as, right, so the minstrel stage was, the argument was, oh, Black people are happy being under our governance. And I mean, the word governance is very important there, which again goes to the, already kind of flagging the question, what does this imaginative product produce? It produces a form of governance, whether that's the governance of the self, which I think someone like Saidiya Hartman talks about. So this was the kind of argument, if you will, of the minstrel stage, that, oh, Black people are actually happy. If they're not happy, kind of like a horse pulling a cart, they're better off, or a dog with a master, they're better off under this kind of governance and labor regime that is plantation slavery. A lot of the abolitionists, of course, which is, an increasingly bigger group, but starts out as a smaller group, are hearing the sounds of the enslaved, it's a similar reservoir to what minstrelsy claims to be emerging from, right? It's, it's white people being like, I heard them do this. I heard Black people did this. I saw a Black person perform, and this is what they performed like, this is what they looked like or sounded like to me. Abolitionists countered that. It was a direct response. A lot of abolitionism at a sonic level, if you will, was a direct response to minstrelsy, right? So it was like, no, what you're hearing as happy, fanciful dancing is actually the groans of suffering and the plight of Black people. And you'll have people like Douglass say this, but before him there are some white abolitionists who will say things like this, like, in the sorrows of the enslaved we hear a nascent humanity, bubbling, that is yearning to get free. Which, right there again, this is probably more what I talk about in the book, but I do talk a lot about the minstrel stage too, because it's impossible not to talk about them as co-constitutive, is also part of my point. You have this kind of framing of a teleology, a goal, a trajectory for the enslaved that almost, in a kind of, this is where the kinds of political projects, there's a lot of fear on certainly the anti-abolitionist side, but also on the abolitionist side, that if we do let these people go, they're going to kill us. It's very similar arguments people make now with like land back and, prison abolition. They're like, oh, which is obviously a confession of the colonizer being like, well, I did this to you, so of course you would do it to me. Regardless of what, what has, there's a lot of, Cedric Robinson writes about that kind of in Black Marxism, right? A lot in that one chapter, a couple chapters. So there is this profound anxiety, even amongst the kind of good white people, that if we do liberate these people in a very 18th century way, who's going to refine them into humanity so that they don't kill us, commit crimes, I mean, sexually assault, there's a lot of the same kind of paranoias that you see 100 years later in like Birth of a Nation. I mean, it's like a lot of abolitionist people, even if they could see that slavery was wrong, didn't necessarily think, oh, these people wouldn't do that, like these kinds of, fantastic racial fantasies of violence that are more accurate, of course, to what white people were doing to the enslaved black people than what black people did when they did get free, or even, so there that a lot of that context is where I situate Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass was an immediate kind of translator of that so-called slave humanity through music, and he was like, these are the kinds of, very in line with the abolitionist movement, right? These are the kinds of sounds I hear in these are what I remember from the slave community. And the power he has, of course, or perhaps people, there's obviously people that say white abolitionists don't, who are writing around the same time, is that he was a slave, right? He comes from this context where he's like, I was in the slave community, to use Angela Davis's term. I was in the circle. I was around the ring shout. I was, all these kinds of things. And I I'm the kind of unique translator, and I would even say like representer, to use that, kind of like of these sounds that are here to, like before this point, looked at as, to use like aesthetic language, looked at as ugly, right? These are only sounds that signify abject pain and torture and hatred. So there is no, the question for like something like the abolitionist movement becomes eventually, and of course, the point of manumission is like, well, okay, we understand the negative capacity of slavery, negative speaking, yeah, like in terms of how it negates humanity. We understand the groans. What's the positive that's going to be extracted from that? Like, are we just letting people out, so to speak, that have been totally unrefined, to use again an aesthetic term, by this brutal system? And we could also talk about that too, maybe, I think, because you have the question later about Brazil. These are people that, as far as we understand it, have not produced culture. We don't understand it at the time that slaves have produced culture. So they don't have, again, to speak in kind of an 18th century conception of it, but I don't think this ever changes, to be honest. They have not produced the kinds of refining, self-regulating practices that culture serves as. And the reason I would say that is because this is the way Europeans look at music for themselves, and looking at the Enlightenment. It's like art does this. It involves this sort of self-regulation, as well as this sort of prowess for the production of a self that can govern themselves. So there's an immediate aspect to the abolitionist movement where, at the very least, it has a productive capacity that it instills in the enslaved for when they get free. Don't worry, they will produce this kind of sound, for lack of it. And it's not just sound, but they will produce this kind of sound. Whether we're calling it a music not is contested, but they will produce this kind of sound that suggests a humanity in a very kind of developmental ethos to us, meaning they are the child race, as Du Bois, kind of uses that framework, as a lot of people do in the 19th century. They will eventually get to where we are, but this is what they're producing, right? So to the question about speculation, this is a kind of speculative power that white folks, and again, you can look at Douglass as a black person who eventually becomes part of the bourgeoisie, or the owning class. I mean, he owns quite a bit of property, especially his family, which we could even do. Who one of his sons was the first black violinist to be recorded, and kind of very seminal in starting music, or grandson, excuse me, in starting sort of black musical institutions in the late 19th, early 20th century. But he's sort of the first bearer of these sounds as a site of the production of something like black humanity after slavery, right? And I'm putting that, sorry, I realize not everyone's watching this. I'm putting air quotes around that. So it's a way to find, and what kind of aesthetics in particular, what they give this moment, right, is that they suggest a form of self-regulation. And not just self-regulation. So self-regulation will be produced. These people will produce a kind of self-regulation that we'll eventually see in forms of music, but they'll also produce something for us. right? There's also something, which is the obvious thing that's going on the whole time with any of these people listening to music, whether they're abolitionists or anti-abolitionists, right? Is this kind of need for a cultural product, which I think this is the era, especially by the time we get to the late 19th century, the era of cultural products that will have a kind of, again, sort of speculative value that we don't have in this moment of uncertainty. Like, and again, as you think of the way that capitalism's prowess exists in the ability to produce a speculative future, right? Like, it's all about the future. So that's very much like what you see going on with the mid 19th century and Frederick Douglass is like, no, don't worry, these people will, again, they will be up from slavery. They will be. And so I mostly look at like the narratives in the life of Frederick Douglass, which were, of course, big textual points for people like Sadie Hartman, Fred Moten's In the Brick was a big influencing in graduate school and beyond. And so kind of looking at the way that it's sort of about almost sort of the culturification of Black people, if you like. I don't use that word in it, but it is like, how does this become a site to regulate the unknowable, the opaque imagination of Black people, because we don't know we never imagined these people as sentient beings on some level, ambivalently so. So how do we ensure a kind of arresting of that imagination, self-arresting, that they won't kill us, et cetera, all these other things. They won't form alternatives to this system we've invented for them, et cetera. And then how do we engender some, if not industry, I don't think Black music is not quite looked at as an industry yet. And I much more have to go into the late 19th, early 20th century for that, which I talk about. But how do we develop some kind of regime with a product that these people can produce? And I don't want to discount like the obvious examples of prisons and other things, and that a lot of people did the same material labor, sharecropping, things like that. But one that's less talked about in that trajectory is this kind of imaginative product that is Black music and Black art, which is where Black art comes from, I think, in my treatment of it. So I don't know if that necessarily answered you about Douglass, but we could talk more about
No,
that.
it's great. I mean, I think one of the things that it makes me think about too is like, if you study like, Stuckey and like, work around like the ring shouts and like all of the, there was a lot of fear among Europeans about all the things that, especially after Nat Turner, after
Mm-hmm.
Denmark Vesey,
Yeah.
about what was being planned, right? And what was being communicated and discussed in these spaces that Europeans didn't understand at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like they didn't understand the language often or what was being communicated, right? Um, that to then channel all of that, which, to use one of your terms, like inscrutable, right? Is that what
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
where they really don't know what's going on, what it means, but it concerns them. And I think Du Bois also talks in Philly about like all of the work that was done too to police just Black people being together in
Mm-hmm.
spaces like
Yeah.
in public, right?
Yeah.
Um and it's interesting to think about this going on simultaneously with that, like of like, okay, well, we have all these concerns about sort of what we're doing in all of these spaces that we don't actually understand. I mean, as you said, like there was all this work among even the abolitionists, but also funded by, big capitalists in terms of like creating, you know, these like early social work, and manuals
Mm-hmm.
and stuff of like how to be this teaching
Yeah.
self-regulating individual,
Yeah.
crap, so that people could do labor in a setting where there wasn't
Mm-hmm.
somebody with a whip and a gun, right?
Yeah.
Um, and simultaneously to all of that, you have musical forms being, put forward by the abolitionists, people like Douglas participating in it, and, you know, let's work these songs into English. Let's give them certain, message. Again, this demonstration. I mean, this is one of the things that stuck out to me in those early chapters is like, um, the music sort of demonstrating the humanity, right? Or
Yeah.
that, and meaning that in a very like European humanistic, kind of frame, of what we would mean by that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say there's this very interesting moment if you look in across kind of pulling musical figures out of narrative in the life of Frederick Douglass, where he talks about, right, the sound of the whip. And he talks about, for example, the scream famously in Moon and Hartman talk about this a lot, right? The screams of Aunt Hester. And he talks about that. And he'll also talk about kind of what he perceives as Black musical. He also talks about Black moment, and this is actually, I think, in another writing, talks about the moments of more officialized Black music. He mostly feels like they're kind of he doesn't use this word, but like a kind of false consciousness that slaves are given leisure time exclusively, that the leisure time of slaves is exclusively controlled by the master. And there's an argument around that, of course, that broadly connects it to capitalism, because it's like Adorno talks about this with labor time, is that you have leisure time because you have labor time, and to the extent that one occasions the other is the only reason it exists. But he has this sort of idea that more or less all Black sound under slavery is just a product of the whip, to put it simply. And he kind of talks about that as the sound of the whip. And later, when well, not later, but narratively later, when he lands on, when he's enters, he crosses the Mason-Dixon, whatever, and he's in, I think, Maryland. Um, he talks about dock workers, and he talks about like, there was such a quiet efficiency to their labor. I heard none of the groans of this pained humanity. And I think it's very fascinating, because really what that depicts is that, well, to be an official regulated worker, it means you have the sound of the whip inside your head. I mean, there is the boss, I mean, in a lot of cases, bosses did use physical violence. I mean, of course, especially during this time. That it's funny that he doesn't see that. Like, there's unionization, there's all these things going on that maybe we don't literally see a whip, but there is, weapons being used against workers. But in that moment he describes, which I think, yeah, is in the narrative of the life, he talks about how there's like a quiet sound of their humming, and there's like music going on in their head that keeps them working. And it's funny that he doesn't assume that's a kind of whip, right? So it is very much to your point about the self-regulation. He's like, the goal of his kind of Black historical laboring subject, right, is someone who, he's got the cop in their head, choose the no Black anarchism, so it is like someone who's like, they have internalized the whip. You don't need, there's something, again, very 18th, 19th century aesthetic. There's something very ungainly, they'll use the word when they describe melodies, because ungainly about the whip. We don't want to see the violence that makes labor productive during slavery. And almost that's the most upsetting part, which again, you could think of the trajectory of capitalism, right? Where people, and I talk about this in the trajectory of the book, right, that the whip is beautified. That's what gets liberated from slavery. And not just against Black people, but against everyone, right? Is that we have these regimes of labor that are meant to look nicer, if even by virtue of them being disguised totally from us, like in factories and places we don't see, that essentially make the sound of the whip less unpleasant, like, or inaudible to us, we could say, especially when we talk about the traversal of distance, which is very central to his own journey. But it's so fascinating because he doesn't see like dock workers as being dehumanized, and you're kind of like, well, why wouldn't you think, anyway. So there is, to your point, there is very much an ethos in him of a kind of self-regulation. And the reason to your earlier question, why I talk about him as the first Black artist, is because he is about beautifying the world after slavery. I mean, that's my sense, is like, I think that is one of those moments where you see that, as opposed to being like, well, Black slavery is brutal, but what Black people get free, like, this shit's terrible too. Like, wage labor is terrible and impressive too, right? There's not really that kind of, at least at this moment, critique of racial capitalism, right? It's very much just like, this is a barbaric, we could use the word, right, in the terms of the West is always against barbarism, to the extent that barbarism is always a thing of the past, right? Or always trajectory, in terms of geographical trajectory, something down south, right? Like, it's not, there is no northern barbarism for the most part to him, because there's that quiet self-regulatory whip inside the head of these workers, so yeah.
Yeah. So I found this section on A. Simpson. I don't know what his actual first name is, but he's a he's a ethnographer or
Yeah.
ish, right? And he, as you mentioned, he goes to Brazil. This is the Brazil section, and he's like documenting the African capacity for music. And I found it really interesting, I guess, in part because there's always this, kind of saying or, you know, this feeling that black people have an innate capacity for
Hmm.
music, right? Like you hear this all the time, right? Like black babies are born with rhythm, like this kind of, thing. And i- what his thing is like sort of like, well, I'll let you say it, but like just talk about this, like what he does, what he goes, why he's doing it, and kind of what meaning you draw from this, story.
Yeah, I could totally. I think that's a good thing to talk about. It also repeats as a figure, which I'm glad you brought in the contemporary example because there is so the minstrel stage, the argument of minstrelsy, but also it wasn't that different from, in a certain kind of way, the argument of abolitionists was there is this kind of innate capacity in Black folks to produce music, which has a part to do with this sort of like intentionally produced inscrutability that you're referring to, right? Which is some of which is, kind of a simple way, like a refusal, an invested refusal, and not seeing them like us. Certainly that's in there. But it also, as I try to kind of look at it more, like what you're saying, is an invested authority about what kind among them, not the only kind, of course, but what kind of labor these people can do, particularly in a kind of public setting. Like, again, because that being, as you alluded to, a kind of, to this day, fear of Black people being in public. um, and so in that, one of the proclamations, or one of the claims, sorry, of the minstrel stage was that, like, well, Black people are inherently more musical. And I kind of talk a little bit about the 18th, 19th century conception of like these kinds of hierarchies of being, where music was looked at as a much more, a lower form of development as far as people's capacities for sentience and reason, and I mean, this is really very Platonic, if anything, too. You go back to the Greeks on some level for like people like Hegel and that are talking about this. And so to challenge that, because there is, especially as the minstrel stage kind of winds down as being as influential, I guess, in the by the time you get to the late 19th century, there is this um, this quest by some, to contest the idea that are Black people are inherently musical, right? Which is what this Simpson person studies, and part of that is also, as because he's going to Brazil in, I'm forgetting the year off the top of my head, but I think it's after the manumission of slavery in the U.S., but before it in Brazil, and or close to the manumission of slavery in the U.S., but before it in Brazil. And the other
It's
reason,
it's a 1868 article.
right?
So yeah.
Okay, so just after right after the end of the Civil War and stuff. So the other part of that is too is we're starting to see in Europe and amongst Europeans by the middle late 19th century that music, and I mean, I talk about someone like Nietzsche is a great example, probably the peak of this example, right? Music is becoming actually a the most human thing, right? Like it's the most human site. It's the most central site for the reproduction of humanity. There's a couple of Nietzsche quotes I use that reflect that, right? So it's also this moment where, in a certain way, as culture becomes broader and is something that's both contained and both possessed by the aristocracy and the kind of maybe burgeoning nouveau riche is a little bit early for that, but there also becomes this kind of guard against, like, well, actually, can Black people make music? Because to say that, to admit that, means they can make culture. And to your point, I think it's such a funny moment because, and this is why the book is, to your earlier question, like what made me write it, is it I kind of view it as very much a history of the present in this way, because that is still an argument. I mean, you can look, but like it goes both ways. There is still an argument about like whether Black musics are serious forms of music, or whether Black art is a serious form of Black. You guys do the film one a lot, like whether Black film is a serious. It's a little different with film, I think, for a lot of reasons. But and so there is on the one side this this path towards humanization and a so-called serious art, which has a lot to do with sentience and structure and musical structure. Can Black people, are they actually applying musical structure to the sounds they made? Especially because not long ago, at the same time, abolitionists are saying these sounds are emanating from them spontaneously, almost like, you know, people talked about jazz like this, like Ben Sidran's jazz talk, where it was like, oh, Black people just talk like jazz, you know, or when we were growing up, I feel like it was like, oh, Black people just rap naturally. They don't, you know, as if they weren't practicing. I was like, well, I don't rhyme when I talk normally, but it's very much like an 80s, 90s kind of discourse, maybe into the 2000s, where it was like, oh, you know, they just, that slang just flows right into rap. So there
Yeah,
is that.
and just the point quickly that you make too
Yeah.
about whether it's music. I mean, that was heavy with rap for people who
Oh,
weren't
yeah.
there in the
Yeah.
80s and the 90s. Like it
Yeah.
was very there's a long time where people would just like refuse to accept that it was like a
Yeah.
legitimate form of music. So yeah.
Yeah. And right, that's exactly. And I mean, that was a big, you know, Hot 97 wouldn't play it until like the early 80s. You know, they said for people in New York, we have to have a New York reference. We have hip hop. A friend of mine would hate that. But yeah, that, and I, you know, so the other reason I bring that up in the context of the book is I'm also like, to put it simply, I'm like, well, of course, this is a kind of trap, because it also is, to the earlier, the way the conversation started and the way book starts is like, well, what's the point of it? What is the goal of an art? I don't, you know, but this would be maybe a way to talk up. We could talk about this again when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance, because this is absolutely the project of the Harlem Renaissance, is to refine an art or arts. But so that's one argument. The other argument, of course, back to the, what you alluded to, is the kind of anti-abolitionist, but I think that, you know, it's a cross perspective of like, oh, Black people are naturally musical. You know, it's very similar to the way we see this repeated as a figure of their kind of almost like, this is the, you know, you have to, this is also the era, not that it's ever ended, but the era of kind of eugenics and other things, and this idea that people naturally produce things that kind of reify their station in life, right? Like naturally producing criminality, naturally producing. So this is also what these kind of debates hinge around, is like, can these people actually produce music? And it goes right back to Frederick Douglass, where it is also, can these people attain a kind of humanity if they can produce music? Is that what it means to acknowledge that? Um, and there's this person, A. Simpson, who goes to Brazil, and is, I mean, I could read the little section because I have it pulled up, but he says, it has been a common idea for many years, accepted without examination or proof. This is very rational language of application, that the Negro was essentially musical in nature. So again, that kind of terminology. We now venture boldly to assert that the claim is unfounded in fact, and that while the Negro possesses capacity for acquiring certain degrees of musical knowledge, which he gets from his organ of imitativeness, which is, there could be a whole thing written about. I do write about that in the George W. Johnson chapter. He has in his native state, to which only we must look in examining the question, no idea whatever of music, so far as melody or harmony is an essential ingredient of such a quality. So there is, this is, you know, the other reason I put it is that this is an early form of ethnomusicology, right? Like, depending on what people characterize as the origins of ethnomusicology, a lot of particularly American ethnomusicology is built up through the study of Black people and Indigenous people, very similar to American anthropology, right? So there is these, I kind of think of this as, there are sort of recurrent moments, you know, if one wanted to think of it dialectically, but I think it's part of a long process. Because what I was going to say earlier is that, like, you think of us Black people, and I think people think of us as extremely cultureful, right? But that was not a, like, we exude culture at all times. I mean, I think that is entirely the way this sort of spectacularized contemporary notion of Black people, that probably doesn't start to exist until the 50s or so, maybe the 40s and 50s, academically, with, you know, Herskowitz's work, where he, you know, there's, of course, that also that argument, which I actually should mention this too, whether Black people retained any culture, right, from the slave trade, from the Middle Passage, from the plantation, right? Because it was like, this was such a violent endeavor. They may have again, it's this very developmental ethos, developed in terms of development, and it's all its kind of common Enlightenment and economistic thinking, right? Like, oh, well, they might have humanity. We're acknowledging that in 1868, or starting to, but do they have the highest forms of humanity, which are increasingly these notions in a 19th century conception? But again, I think people still think this way, of culture, right? To be able to produce culture is this kind of pinnacle of human being, to use it and framing it that way as a practice. And so you start to see these kinds of debates now that we've, to think of it linearly to the extent that it is, that like, okay, they have humanity, but do they have the ability to produce culture? And again, I think it's an interesting one because that is always written in these kinds of intra-institutional complaints by Black artists, which are like about they don't see my art as real art. It's very much like, to put it super simply, is like a white validation thing. It's like, then don't make art there. I don't like when it's always a very easy answer. I know you have a two-man a lot too, so talk about that kind of thing where you're like, how much of your life is oriented, and like energies and imaginative space is oriented towards proving this kind of rationalized capacity to make this thing for these people who are destroying people like you, but maybe they're like not destroying, you're the one that made it out, again, Frederick Douglass, so you're not quite being destroyed in the same way the rest of us. You're kind of, or Fanon, we can think of in a certain way, talking about this kind of predicament. So that is one of the reasons I kind of talk about that. And then I also kind of talk about the, how if we look at this moment, like he records a lot of the sounds of these rituals in Brazil, and he's like, he records the sounds as like these sort of pre-linguistic sounds, we might call them. And then he's like, well, these aren't music, which, of course, to our 21st century understanding of music, we could be like, well, why not? But it has to do with the fact that, again, to kind of look at that trajectory of the aesthetic, right, and this deeply informed something like the Harlem Renaissance that comes much later, there always has to be this kind of project of regulation and refinement within the musical, right? So like there actually is something very terrifying about kind of unregulated public sound, right? In a way that you go back to the beginning of the book, right? And so it also is one of these moments in it, it's when you start to see a thing that I think goes on even to when we were growing up, but also exists, throughout the 20th century, of this kind of, again, and it's also found in Douglass, is this kind of, Daphne Brooks, I think, uses the term looking glass, right? Where it's like about it's like about kind of turning Black people into, or finding a version of a kind of looking glass for them. Like, how do we actively construct a kind of interiority of Black people? Because there's kind of interiority that needs to be, seized upon by the, kind of like a certain form of racial capitalist production in order to do a kind of work to turn that interiority into a productive space, right? Which is, down, not rioting, among other things, not coming and killing us. And so that's very much where this debate around music becomes staked out in this.
Yeah, which I think is such a, I mean, I don't know. I hope people are very conscious of all the ways, especially if you watch our channel, and of all the effort that goes into trying to shape our interiorities, right?
Mhm.
But you can understand that, I think, thinking about slave society, right? Who that has just manumitted. And somebody asked a question of like, why use that term and not abolition? I mean, it's not something that I'm super invested in actually that deeply one way or another. I mean, manumission is actually the process for an individual person basically to move
Mhm.
from slavery to emancipated, um an abolition would be like the bigger process. Partly why I like manumission is I think it's more, maybe it's actually not a fair thing, but I think, nowadays, and probably even in that moment too, for a lot of people, like, abolition can call to mind like a huge transition. And I mean, sure, it was a
Mhm.
big transition, but um, you know, I think that there's all the ways that like your work, Saidiya Hartman's work, etc., like show that actually what happened was like not, you know, it, it was on a big scale, but the outcome of it is rather underwhelming if you're thinking about freedom or liberation, right? Like, I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, manumission sounds like more of the bureaucratic, kind of reconfiguring of things,
Yeah.
to me than something like abolition does. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that was very well said. I agree with all that. And I think also like, and the term I use a lot in the book is the term slave society, which is from, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the right name right, but Gira Binder, I think was a legal scholar from the essay written some time ago. And they talk about this idea that they also use the framework of manumission and are kind of like, well, an obvious point that I think anyone listening to this is going to agree with is like, well, they didn't abolish the racist society that made slavery, that enslaved people. you know all the same families were wealthy, all the you can draw a line back to those families owning, whether moving to the colonies or moving back to Africa, so to speak. I mean, if anyone went back to Africa, was the government during the 1880s, and particularly the breaking up of Africa by the European powers. And so, there is that immediate point. And the other way I talk about it a lot too, to that effect, is that in a lot of ways the slave society was not abolished, it was liberated. It was liberated through that moment of emancipation. That's all that was liberated. People may have been manumitted in that your legal status changed individually on certain levels. Of course, there's also the very vital history to get into that I allude to, especially when we talk about the blues a little bit, of like convict leasing and prisons. And Du Bois talks about this in Black Reconstruction, like, of things that were slavery by another name or worse. Like, I mean, in some cases you could argue worse, especially because they didn't have the kinds of, they were invisibilized in a way to a lot of greater extent, and they kind of involved, I mean, I would say also worse in that they also had a broader surveillance net around them. Things like the black codes that were instituted in the U.S. During Reconstruction and after that, are basically our policing today. So like, the manumission is a way to talk about which of course you alluded to, the sort of reformative gesture, or the reform gesture that was that moment, which was not a gesture. It was not, it's the phenomenon like decolonization cannot be decided over the negotiating table or whatever, the kind of, and that's like, it feels sort of obvious when you think about the US that way, as opposed to thinking about it as exceptional from colonial context. But like, yeah, what was, Lincoln was assigned something and everything was better, or not that I know that's not in the question, but I think it's really important we press against that, because there's still a lot of people that have either a common or even very deep understanding that might be what happened. And so in the book, I talk a lot about structures of oppression during slavery as being liberated, and not the enslaved, right? And that what is liberated, again, in the tradition of liberalism, which we live in a liberal fascist society, to the extent there's a difference between those two things, is the liberation of these kinds of mechanisms of regulation and governance. And so that's also, to our earlier conversations, that's something I look a lot at, rather than being like, and again, you could look at the way people like Sylvia Wynter or a lot of the sort of critiques of humanism through Blackness have gone, is also pointing to the way that humanity and humanism in a ways were like another kind of capture that was awaiting, if not kind of working through Black folks when they got manumitted. And I think if you think of one of the reasons I talk about Douglass, but also one of the reasons I talk about this first Black recording artist, George W. Johnson, is that there's a lot of that kind of gets heaped onto him around criminalization, self-regulation. And so that kind of becomes, obviously someone like Sadie Hartman's written about this a lot, that becomes kind of the new mode of management of Black life, that's not limited to the relatively limited to the exclusive governance of the plantation, but in a way, it's actually a bigger responsibility of the world to police Black people than, because they don't got a master. Like, it's not like a dog running away where it's like, whose dog is it? It's not that kind of society as much anymore. It's much more like, again, the liberation of mastery that goes back to the minstrel stage. Is like, oh, we all get to take part in some version of this. It's the same way personal property is invented during this time. I talk a lot about property, which there was a lot more in it, but they made me take it out. It went a lot different. I teach classes on property and things like that too. So there's a lot about the relationship to property that, again, gets reformed. It doesn't get abolished. We don't experience after slavery the collectivization of the means of production, anything like that. And to the extent that Black people try to make those kinds of things, they're usually destroyed. But yeah, yeah. So
No, appreciate that. Yeah, somebody in the chat, a couple people in the chat were talking about Haiti or IT as a counter example, right? Of
yeah,
it's not a manumission, right? Because it's actually one, right? And I think
yeah,
that's although I mean certainly Black folks' role in the Civil War, right, is definitely decisive in that regard too. Um, so let's talk about the Harlem Renaissance. And I know I'm skipping over. I have to pick my spots because there's like a
sure,
lot in this book that we could go into. Um, but you write, I theorize what many Black music scholars are uneasy about considering how Black music has justified us from without and from within to the imagination of the slave society and to our imaginative practices with each other, end quote. And so, um, yeah, I mean, this whole section on the Harlem Renaissance is really interesting. I loved that quote. Obviously, it's something you've already talked about to some degree already. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that and some of the, you know, the the work going on in the Harlem Renaissance. I know we're going to talk about Ma Rainey as a counterexample later, but folks like Alain Locke and others that you're looking at there.
yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, I think that that is something that still exists. Like it's a, there is this. I use this very famous quote from Nietzsche that is, he says, quote, this is from The Birth of Tragedy, I think. He says, "We have our highest dignity in our significance as works of art, for it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence in the world are eternally justified." And I kind of wanted, I thought that like to him, that's a provocation, make art, the kind of, to the extent that people would, Dionysian kind of like the bacchanalic sort of like make art, people reclaim that kind of energy in like maybe the 60s too. But I kind of look at it as a doomed sentence, that like it's a problem, right? Like this is a kind of a different form of bondage, right? That I kind of like I alluded to earlier with Frederick Douglass, that like you people must continually justify yourselves through your as to use a term from Nietzsche, representing beings. Like you have the capacity to represent. I mean, and I think that's unmistakably, if we were to jump now, we'll go to the Harlem Renaissance because I think this is also kind of where it comes from in a way that's more codified. This is unmistakably the way we look at so-called conversations about representation, right? And I'm using scare quotes around representation. I guess I don't need to use quotes. It is the way we talk about representation. So these lines by Nietzsche, they're written like I think I'll say is 1870s, 1870s, 1880s, before the Harlem Renaissance. But I think it's very much that period, and you see this in someone like Du Bois's early writings. I think they become more complex, and I can talk about that too, like in the 1920s. But in something like The Souls of Black Folks, there very much is this grammar of like civilizational language that you see in also someone like Locke, really anyone in the 19th century who's writing, I think, like including Marx. Like, I mean, there's these kinds of developmental logics of people that, of course, get applied negatively, meaning in terms of negation to like indigenous and Black people. But you see someone like Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folks talking about like this child race, right, which was a common phrasing at the time. And how are we going to kind of prove ourselves to a broader society? But also, there is a sense of proving ourselves to ourselves, but I don't think that's, I mean, I sort of, as you alluded to in that quote, we don't ever get, there is no, it's much more murky. We can go back to the way we started this conversation around the murals. And so, you also have to think about this time. This is, so you see kind of this breaking down of the aristocracy. You see this liberation of the idea of culture in the 19th century and certainly in the 20th century, where you also start to see the invention of something we would maybe kind of call the middle class, being, like in the US at least. And so you see the capacity to produce culture being liberated, right? Which is also a way to talk about, maybe we could call it liberalism, or we could even allude to it as neoliberalism, depending on how we think is like kind of liberalism from above, right? It trickles down, so to speak. The capacity to produce culture trickles down in this case, to the extent that it's benefits the reproduction of the society of the ruling classes, the racial capitalist regime of the ruling classes. So you start to see this is part of this moment as well. The other big thing, right, which maybe people would kind of just casually know, of course, right, we see the invention of the phonograph, I mean, really technically like the 1870s, but it becomes sort of a popular object in like the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. By the time we get to like the mid 1910s, people know what a phonograph is. 1920s, people certainly know. The Harlem Renaissance, people certainly know what reproduced music is, which is a better way to talk about it. We also get, of course, film, right? And you could look back to like Birth of a Nation and things like that, which was like 1914, I want to say, or 1914, 1915. So the way that what kind of art or the aesthetic becomes is this capacity to eternally justify oneself. And it becomes that way partially because of this sort of like, I don't want to call it panoptic, but like sort of this sort of surveillance architecture, if you will, of culture, of cultural representing machines. I talk a lot about this when I talk about the phonograph, and that there is always this sense in the writings of people like Alain Locke that like we are being produced from without, right? And we will see going back to the minstrel stage, which doesn't really exist then in it's traditional thing, but there's still blackface, lots of blackface representations in movies, everything. We just mentioned Birth of a Nation. The audio I look at, there are audio representations of blackface minstrelsy. Um, these are the kinds of things that Alain Locke will, of course, point out as like, well, this is the problem, is that we are being justified from without, meaning from outside our community, not by, there are black people doing blackface, but, people who are not part of this kind of project, that's not just the Harlem Renaissance, but this kind of project of representation that the Harlem Renaissance I look at in a lot of ways, I think it's more complicated by its artists, some of its artists, than it is by its sort of pontiffs like Alain Locke or even to some degree Du Bois, although he has some interesting ideas too that I talk about. But the project of the Harlem Renaissance I look at a lot is this way of internalized justification, right? Like a little like we saw in Douglass, right? Like how do we produce a positive engine of imagination that proves, if we go back to that writing the Simpson example, there's a lot of this like proof, evidence, facticity. How do we create things that prove and kind of eternally justify us, which is like a very, artistic term in a romantic sense of eternal art. How do we create things that prove us to the society from without? And then a lot of something that Alain Locke's going to talk about is also, again, kind of riffing off of Douglass, what can kind of justify ourselves within our community, like not so much being accountable to our community, but what can be produced aesthetically to refine the unrefined among us, right? So like the black people, to use that term from Saidiya Hartman, who's talking about this, the Philadelphia Negro, which you also referenced earlier, these kind of unruly black folks, who are in a number of ways have a kind of public ungainliness to them that, again, we could look back in the way black people were talked about during slavery, that must be refined, with this kind of aesthetic education, which will serve, again, we could also call it policing, right? I mean, there's ways in which I make that obvious connection, which if people go back and look at something like, I think quoted at the beginning of the book is Michel Desartaux, the French author, and he talks in, I think, one of his books about history about like the term police being connected to ecclesiastical culture. So the people who had culture were the people in the church who could police other people. Like, you're not wearing your robes properly. You're not, these sort of sumptuary things. You're not, playing the right music publicly. You're not. So it's not far to say, and that's sort of one of the paradigms I look at the Harlem Renaissance from, is that the sort of spokesmen of the Harlem Renaissance become these kind of people like, how can we use culture to police our activities into a way that, it justifies us from, and I use the word justification to also complicate this idea of justice too as a goal, but how can it justify us to other people? In other words, the big fear, even in the Harlem Renaissance, and certainly you see this in Du Bois, is like, I can't pull the quote up right now, sorry, but it's like, where he's like, if we don't do this, lest we be consigned to slavery, is a frequent expression. I think he even says that in Black Reconstruction, which is written a bit later. And so, so like, there is a constant sense that if which I think is a very, it should say a lot, but I think this actually does still very much determine Black folks' ways of being in the world in a way that, like, the idea that being subject to a wide scale structural oppression, this goes back to the manumission question, is something that can be obviated or confronted with our sort of internal policing. And that, you know, if we didn't do that, we might be justified in the kinds of things we would, of course, just understandably view as a punishment, which is, you know, enslavement or other sort of similar forms of subjugation. So that becomes very big for someone like Locke. And the interesting thing I talk about with him is that he talks a lot about that justification as having a value, because he's very much like a value thinker. He's kind of influenced by, like, not so much what we maybe would folks would read on the channel, like, you know, continental sort of thinking, but also by like a lot of the British philosophers and people like that that he reads, and like William James and people like that, who's really big in the U.S. at that point or around that point. And so there's very much this notion that that internalized capacity to justify ourselves is itself a value. And I think that this is where, if I were to speak, and this is not super radical, because I think most people in that study Black art in the US would kind of locate the Harlem Renaissance as the first big moment of Black art, even if it's not literally the first Black artist. They would kind of traditionally study that moment, and then they would probably go to the Black arts movement. Maybe they would talk about the 30s, which is interesting too. But yeah, so that's kind of the way I frame the Harlem Renaissance, is like thinking about, again, in terms of its sort of bourgeois discourse, but also the I mean, you know, this gets built into a lot of institutions, that some of which still exist in places like New York, of like refinement, education. And I think even when they allow a kind of symbolically unruly form of Black being in them, which is maybe something we talk about when we talk about the 60s or post 60s, even, they're still doing that kind of activity of showing us, back to the earlier way we started this conversation, like, these are the safe ones who are, you know, these, don't worry, they're not going to break the glass outside your condo. These are the ones that kind of, you can actually put this in your condo. You know, you can actually hang this painting, which is probably, you know, this would be the period where it would be the earliest sort of period people buy Black American art. I mean, I know this differs for like African art, or someone mentioned Haiti, like, you know, Caribbean art and things like that. But that, you know, that's very much an essential value of, or an essential project of someone like Alain Locke, is kind of this, he has this very value laden conception of justification, you know, and he uses the word comportment and other sorts of words that, again, people might look at that period and be like, oh, that's too stodgy. We're making art in the post 60s, you know, happening, Schechner, whatever kind of you know, Black Power, what, all the things that are happening in the 60s, which is too much to go into all of it. But, you know, these are things that are, um, these destroyed these notions of comportment and self-justification, but I actually don't think so. I think they intensified them. And I think they, again, to use that framework, I think they actually liberated them into more of the engines of, you know, things like, yeah, we could call them surveillance, like online and, you know, or social media or whatever and things. So that's kind of the way I look at that racial class project that is the Harlem Renaissance, which we could also talk about that too. But
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, we're not going to go there today because you don't get to this period in the book, but it makes me we definitely have to do a episode of Rap Album Dialectics together where we talk about an album and a period, because I also do think that what you're talking about becomes
yeah,
really interesting when you get to hip hop, right? And
yeah,
like, what does that mean, and how does that work in that period? So yeah, anyway, so let's talk about Ma Rainey, right? As
sure.
the kind of, she's the counter example really that you use in this section. Yeah, talk about, you know, why you chose her and how you think she relates or, you know, opposes this project.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question too. So, like, you know, the other thing that a lot of, and you know, won't get into super the details of like Alain Locke's project, right, is about this kind of it's also goes to that sort of futurity that I alluded to, that's very endemic or essential to racial capitalism, is like about producing a futurity. So it's also kind of about Black art that produces Black art. You know, and I mean, this is also a way to think of like canonization and institutionalization of Black art, which has to be talked about at this time, which the, you know, again, the Harlem Renaissance is very influential in, if not in just founding organizations, but kind of putting together the ethos by which organizations are founded. If even in places that have been founded after the Harlem Renaissance, there is that kind of veneer of justification. And so Ma Rainey is really interesting to me. I mean, she is a Black, queer, maybe we say gender nonconforming, kind of artist. I look at a lot of this period that people like Angela Davis have talked about, and this scholar Kay Hammer talks a lot about, and people like Clyde Woods have talked about, like the blues period. And I think there is something quite interesting in this period, in the sense that there does not, particularly contrary to that, and I actually think this is why you get some of Alain Locke, there is not this fixation with how white people see us, or how we could say the Black bourgeoisie see us, if we see that as any different. There's much more kind of an internal form, almost kind of a material of relationality going on in a lot of these performances, which you can look back at this period, and it's not like this never exists after it, but it's one of these moments which I think we can also understand some, if not a lot, of the Harlem Renaissance as a response to, too, which is another way to think of the policing aspect of the law needing to be laid down against the transgression. Is you see a lot of, like queer trans performance that is kind of, very much not respectable, not like, I mean, a lot of it is, I don't know how much you've listened to, like, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, but even people like Lucille Bogan and those kind of people, and you're like, I'll play that for students, and they're like, how was this made in the 1920s or 1930s? It's like very profane, very, all these kinds of things. And I think there was a lot of that was much more of sort of an internal conversation, if you will, to use that common metaphor of a conversation, that wasn't necessarily about a product that would justify the internal worlds of Black folks to other people. I don't know that there's a lot of playful sort of masquerade and avoidance and kind of intentional opacity in these repertoires that I think, not I think, because there were a lot of people who did not like the blues, like Du Bois and like, Alain Locke hated that, like they really hated the blues, and they were like, and that's the other way to look at the Harlem Renaissance, is like, well, this was a direct response to like the way these people were carrying on, which was much closer, which I think is also interesting too, because it's not like there wasn't a lot of complex musical craft or like great voices or whatever, but I think what also made it dangerous is that there wasn't the conventional bourgeois distinction between the kind of social world of the art and the social world of being Black, in a way that I think, again, looking at the Harlem Renaissance, there is it's more vanguardist, it's much more vanguardist. Like, these are the artists, these are the people who understand the project that, say, someone like Alain Locke is, or you go back again to Frederick Douglass, who's part of this, totally could be considered in kinds of vanguardist terms in a certain way. There's a little bit less of that. It's a lot messier. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting about it, and one could study, it would be interesting to talk about Black music in I've always been interested in a conversation about this at some point, but to think about the way a lot of Black music in the 20th century is this long sort of straightening project, and you get that even with the most beloved music, especially something like I think of the 60s a lot. I grew up listening to a lot of like Sam Cooke and those kind of people, but it's, you look at like the period of Sam Cooke to like Whitney Houston was a great example, right? A queer artist that was forced to present as straight and be straight, whatever, how you want to look at that, even though she was queer, lesbian or queer, I don't know what she would have identified as, but there's this long kind of trajectory by the institutionalizations, and someone like Manning Marable will talk about how the church seized on the civil rights movement to reassert its relevance at a period when it was waning. And you can look at a period like the Harlem Renaissance, particularly in the South, or the first Great Migration, is also being deeply contested, because you see these other kinds of you see these other sort of practices of Black people seizing on their sort of like autonomy, their sexual autonomy. Someone like Angela Davis will talk about how this is a period where people, especially Black women or gender minorities, realize like, oh, we do not have to, our sex is not for like the procreation of Black property. It is not for, this is kind of a long, and especially in cities, less so, because of course in a lot of rural areas, people are still being pushed into a kind of sharecropping, sort of, we need to maintain the sort of structure of the heteronormative family, or whatever you want to call it, kind of normative family, to the extent that we can by virtue of reproducing, um, our productive capacity. Whereas people in cities, where you start to see, or even, I mean, really, it actually does happen in a lot of rural places with the blues, you start to see this turn away from that, and a kind of, bodily autonomy, and a kind of, I mean, to the extent that we want to look at it in terms of labor, a kind of movement away from the romance of artistic labor too, which is already something that the Harlem Renaissance is kind of afraid of. It has to have, and it says a lot, again, in a very European way, that you have to have the romance of artistic labor in order to have this kind of civilizational project take hold. And I think someone like Ma Rainey and a lot of other Black, it's not just her, but like, I think she's like very emblematic of that period. I think she kind of challenges that in a way that's very interesting. And yeah, and breaks up these sort of productive engines, and imagine, and part of that is around this sort of regulation of this imagination that is so central to, you know increasingly official notions of Black art. So
Thank you. So we're gonna move into the Black Arts movement,
ooh.
which I just I enjoyed the whole book, but this was it, I don't mind saying it was my favorite chapter. There's just a lot in it that I really enjoyed. And so start with Larry Neal, who's a really important figure to the Black Arts movement, and the notion of Black beauty that he put forward. What's important to you about this?
So I think this is the most interesting time to me too, and it was kind of like when earlier, when I alluded to being a Black artist, it was very much like the period that I was referring to, where I was like, oh, I mean, the Bay Area is very much like a reservoir of nostalgia for the '60s. Not exclusively, but that definitely is something. It feels very intense in a way, at least when I moved here. And so, while Larry Neal was not living here and writing this, but I was like, oh, this is a place where the Black Power movement is so revered, and there are Black repertory theaters that are still around. I wouldn't necessarily know to say like whether they're how active they are, but there's like one in, I think, in Oakland, kind of close to Berkeley. And so there is this history of these products of the '60s and the Black arts movement. So, I mean, what's interesting about Larry Neal, and I actually say this is still something that informs me to the extent that I make art. I'm making a film, so I do. People read this and they'll be like, "Oh, you just don't want us to make anything," and did it, and it's like, well, if that's what that feels like for you, then I don't said a lot what you was doing it for. I don't know. But so I think that, which also could be something to talk about, like what's the, what am I expecting with the book. But so for me, what was really radical about Larry Neal and the Black arts movement is this idea that we don't need these institutions that are art institutions, and that a Black aesthetic must be something that exists without these institutions, without them, against them even. And this is helpful because it does happen at a time in the 40s, 50s. A lot of Black art that's in, just to pick museums, is not done by a Black artist. But when you start to go into the 60s, 50s, 60s, a lot, what they're realizing, and there is, I'm not going to remember the name of this book, but maybe I can find it. But there is a book, maybe it's called Mounting Frustration, I want to say, that sounds right, that actually talks about how museums in the '60s, and there's, like people like Darby English has that book, 1971. So it's kind of like the late '60s, early '70s, museums, among other institutions, right? I mean, in kind of lockstep with this ethos of integration, realize that the best way to sort of like fight the demands of, Black power, even a kind of vague racial justice, is actually not to exclude Black people, but to let them in, right? And I mean, you talk about a lot, you all talk about this a lot broadly when you do talk about things like counterinsurgency and things. Um, and so someone like Larry Neal writing in the mid '60s is like, no, we don't need these institutions. These are not the things. And I think more radically than that is, I'm not saying it's the first time anyone's ever done it, but this is like, it's not just about where we show art. It's not just about the content of the art. It's about how the art, it's about how what we make, maybe better would put it, ethically relates to other Black people, you know, and that is, I think, a very profound move on his part, where there is this conception that I think is largely gone from I would almost say like especially Black art, where what you do ought to be accountable to other people, you know, especially other Black people. And that's kind of what I began this conversation with. And so there's a much more, you know, and obviously I think this is in his lineage more informed by kinds of, you know, Marxist thinking and left. And there was a really big period of 1930s Black Marxist art, and people like, you know, to a degree Richard, for sure Richard Wright, and to a degree, you know, like Ralph Ellison, other literary, particularly literary figures, but other painters came out of this. But I think that it's undeniably this kind of like, you know, we ought to have a relationship to the people kind of thing. And more than that, I think it's even just this idea that there ought to be a constant, or the way I take it and what I had hoped to kind of bring into my life when I was, you know, or when I first moved here and was making art, was like, there ought to be a constantly revised ethical import to what we're doing that takes precedence. And that we're not just, you know, as the book frequently talks about, kind of putting pictures of Black people on the walls of, you know, condos, whatever, to use that pair. So that's one really big, I think, challenge laid down by Larry Neal's writing. But I also think what is this chapter kind of deals with is the complexity of that, because I think it's worth bringing up. I don't think we talked about this necessarily. One of the other things that's really important in the book is that, well, I talk a lot about these kind of structures of repression. There always has to be some kind of agential aspect to them, even if the person is not Frederick Douglass. Like, this is why the book couldn't be all Frederick Douglass or Alain Locke, right? Is because then we get into this sense by which, like, which is not very relevant for, I think, you know, the current kind of neoliberal order, is like, oh well, people who have privilege or power or whatever, you know, I mean, to the extent that Douglass had these things, they are the ones who are these agentful people who can make kind of conscientious choices that internalize ethics or political decision making. Whereas something I heard a lot making art in the Bay was like, oh, you don't understand, you know, I don't got the privilege to turn down that gig. And again, sometimes people were not being paid for these, you know, gigs for Twitter or whatever, some corporation. So but there's kind of this, for one of the first times under the mantle of a kind of self-conscious Black art. But again, I think you can go back to Frederick Douglass and say, well, on some level, this is what is happening in the so-called slave community. This is what, you know, there is that Fred Moten quote that I really like, that being Black is being Black in groups or being Black with other people or something, you know. And it is like, well, yeah, you couldn't just act out and do whatever you wanted without there being consequences or accountability to the people you care about, or like are in community with, or are neighbors with and cohabitate with, to think of a very classical sense of the political. And so I think that's a really immediate and still under interrogated part of Larry Neal's aesthetic, as far as it relates to our contemporary reality. And but I also talk about like the complexity of the ways people try to thread that through the aesthetic. And particularly, I think something you asked a question about when you sent to me was like this idea of Black beauty. And I think for me, that is a really great problem space of like, can the beautiful hold these kind of ethical relations? Can it be a vehicle or a conduit for the kinds of ethical relations, to go back to what I was talking about earlier with like the condos, how we started this conversation. And you know, ultimately I look at a lot of, including this local Black arts movement poet who passed away not too long ago, Dingane Goncalves, who I think lived in San Francisco and Oakland. And he has this really interesting, hard to find book about Black beauty, or has an essay about Black beauty. And I was kind of interested because the way he talked about beauty, you know, sort of related to Larry Neal's like emphasis on a kind of collectivity. But I think ultimately there's this irreconcilability of the beautiful with a kind of collective project of even sort of ethical being in relation, let alone liberation, I think. And that's sort of, you know, the conclusion I reach in this chapter, is that like the beautiful is not, it's not for that, like, in a way. And that ends up being a really difficult, I think, kind of point of navigation for the Black arts movement, as well as probably, for example, why we still have the Black beautiful, but we don't have the artistic collectives in the 60s that I write about, So yeah, we can.
Yeah, I think we probably want to come back to that point to some degree, because I think it's an important one for sure. Um, so there's this quote. I'm going to read it out. Actually,
Sure.
this passage. This is some of your writing. A danger grew in the power, in the saving power of Baraka's synthesis. This is Amiri Baraka. For what was necessarily antagonistic about the Black queer blues to the enduring and predominating drives of secular and religious Black aesthetic comportment, the policing, not just from without, but also from within, was subsumed under a collective whole, sublated, beautified for this word, the herbarium
Herbarium,
of Black beauty.
herbarium. Well, it
Yeah,
depends on how you pronounce herb.
yeah.
British people.
Right. Of Black
Sorry.
beauty. Paradoxically, this resolution by Baraka was nothing less than a capitulation to the quietude of the beautiful, quote, Black people. So this is from Baraka, I think. Black people
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
unified portrait of strength, beauty, and contemplation, end quote. The sublimation of Black living under beauty's ground facilitated a kind of collection and curation of Black people as Black art. Black beauty put a kind of frame around Black unity, a new structure of capture that facilitated a new site of value. The long history of the curation of Black art as the curation of Black people, to the extent that it relies on the aesthetic character of Blackness, complicated the ethical projects of the Black arts movement. It was almost Warholian in its total artification of Black life. We might ask what outside of the arting of Black life remains for the living. And so, actually, this is perfect because this is kind of what you were just talking about to
yeah,
some degree. So, yeah, to help people understand more, like
yeah.
more context of what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I mean that's a great. I think that's like a really so like first of all, full acknowledgement a danger grew. That's Holderlin, and if you've read, I know that there's Fred says something about not saying Heidegger's first if you call him Marty, or so there's also Heidegger. So I'm covering them. It's Heidegger. So there's Heidegger quotes it a lot too. Not advocating for Heideggerism, but it's
I forgot the last sentence first of
oh
all.
yeah,
So the
yeah,
last
sure,
sentence of the thing is there any future
yeah,
outside of us all being made Black art? That's important. I didn't mean to leave
yeah.
that off. Yeah.
Yeah, no. It's and yeah, and I think that's kind of where the argument of it begins because it is this argument. I think if one were to look at it as I kind of do in the book, I think dialectically, right? You would look at this moment where there is a say in response to the Harlem Renaissance as being a bit too vanguardist, and that's a common critique of it, but especially by a lot of Black arts movement scholars when they talk about that period. And sometimes they'll talk about how people like Langston Hughes already said that. Like he said that during, and he was like, "Well, how's our art change?" I think it's like paying the rent of regular Black people, or so he has some line like that. Langston Hughes, and I think in the 20s. And so there's a lot of Black artists at that time, including Baraka and Larry Neal and numerous others. And I talk about collectives who are weary of the vanguardism of Black art and that it kind of is just sort of the settlement of this small Black bourgeoisie who kind of manage the cultural affairs of Black people, but are again very and then someone like Alain Locke too. To I don't think I mentioned this. He often would use the word class division and talk about it as we have to have that in order to have like a Black civilization. We have to have class division. You can't be civilized and not have class division. Um, so you see that in see that in the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of Black arts movement writers are responding to that, and a lot of the and I think this relates to the artistic movements, and that's also where there's the kind of Warhol reference, Warholian is. I'm sure other people have used it, but I like kind of use it there as like, um, is that what it kind of I think has the effect of doing is there ends up being this for lack of a better word, kind of reaching across the aisle to like the masses of Black people, whatever. Which is not. We could get into the problems of that conception, but and it does so for the purpose of kind of liberating the means to produce to produce the products of art. Like, and I think what you end up with, and what I kind of allude to in that paragraph, is that what you actually get is that, because you have a lot of the institutions of Black life increasingly destroyed post 60s, for a lot of reasons, and including some of the machinations, intentional or otherwise, of Black artists, is that you end up with the kind of, again, I think the critique that a lot of Black radicals, like Black Liberation Army, have of this kind of period of the kind of nascent but emerging cultural nationalism that kind of comes out of it. So you have, that term from Baraka, in a unified portrait of strength, beauty, and contemplation, feels very like a culturally nationalist idea. But I also think it's interesting that he uses the word portrait, right? And that he kind of, it's very much goes back to what I also talk about in the coda of the book too, where there's condos now, which still exist if you go to downtown Oakland, that have a bunch of pictures of Black people on them, in a neighborhood where it would be, possibly expensive for most Black people to live, where Black people are not, encouraged to linger in public. And so you kind of have this effect, which you get with the sort of, neoliberal, I guess it's also a way to kind of criticize some of the nascent, intentional or otherwise, in the Black arts movement, kind of, whether people want to call it an ideological weakness, and that would be more like sort of the conventional, maybe leftist sort of political framing of it, but like to sort of participate in a kind of neoliberalism from below type of structure, where it's like, we now have the capacity to make more of Black life into Black art. And this is the way we avoid the kind of exclusionary logics of a sort of Harlem Renaissance, right? Is that, and I mean, a framing like Black is beautiful is a really good example out of that, where it comes with this kind of capacity and set of more acceptable projects to inaugurate people into the producers and certainly consumers of a kind of widely available Black beauty, but it doesn't, undo the means by which one feels a need to wield that beauty as some kind of defense, or as a friend would call it, armor against this world. And I think it's also a way to kind of look at like, okay, the Black arts movement was opposed to, some of the sort of neoliberal Black artistic institutional forms of art that I would allude to, if someone were to talk about, for example, Black art in the museum. I think it's unavoidable and kind of totally a product of that sort of neoliberal diversity logic, things like that we think of, that we would, don't necessarily do anything for Black people outside the museum, which is most Black. I didn't go to a museum until I was in college, so I didn't, I didn't really art museum. So there's that part of it, and then there is so it's kind of a way to think about like, well, it's not like this is just, but then you look at that period, and again, kind of thinking of a dialectic, it's like that period includes some of the logics and the thinkings and even the grievances of the Black arts movement, which are kind of also about this sort of idea that the ethical relationship to Black life is about this kind of capacity and almost like willingness to reproduce Black people as this representation. And it is this complex way of putting a very simple thing, right? That like, we care about Black people because we have their pictures on our wall type of thing. And that there is a certain form of, this kind of becomes, and actually we didn't talk about this earlier when you asked about like the places where people aren't. There's also a lot in this book about this kind of artificial personhood logic that is very essential to the state and capital, right? Where that is absolutely part of what this is taking part in. That it's like, well, you can have this kind of unified portrait of Black people, and you can have it in a place where there are no Black people. And there is, an undercurrent of course, what was not the goal, I don't think, of the Black arts movement, and quite the opposite. That kind of gets pulled out from under its sort of more dominant or radical tendencies and becomes one of, if not the dominant ethos of Black art, but it also becomes, in some ways, the way people remember it. Like, I think it's kind of similar to the sort of Black Panthers point that I was making, that people kind of, or maybe people do this with MLK a lot too, where they like remember the thing that is like, oh no, we have the, it's Voltaire, we have the world, we actually have the best of all worlds, and that's why, because it did work out. And it's like It's like, no, actually they had a critique of this kind of, but the way it's sort of framed around these notions of beauty and almost like a kind of personal property construction is susceptible to these dominant, orders of racial capitalism that can take that part of it and not have, of course, the larger ethical projects that are connected to it, or can take, like I talk about in the book too, how a lot of Black artistic collectives in the 60s are a site for, something you talk about a fair amount on the podcast, like Ford Foundation funding. And so they're like, oh, if we can get a collective of Black artists to go into a Black neighborhood and help us gentrify it, which can be suppressing political organizing, it can be beautifying the neighborhood, making murals, going back to how we started this. And this was going on in the 60s even, if not earlier, right? Like, so we can kind of use that unified portrait of collective Black being, like, oh, we see a bunch of Black artists come into our neighborhood. I guess that's a good thing. They must be making our lives better. And it's like, no, actually they're trying to make them worse, but they're trying to make the making worse of your life more beautiful, right? Which is different than, I don't know, free housing, other things people would want. So
Yeah, that's great. I'd want to say to the chat, there's a few questions I've flagged, and I will try to get those to Gemma in a bit too. We're kind of winding down. We got a few more questions here, but yeah, I do want to.
Oh, I see comments. I didn't even know there's a tab.
It's all good. But let's talk. This kind of relates to what you were just talking about, the Freddy Fixer sort of phenomenon, and so. I just wrote a note of I want you to talk about the Freddy Fixer to YIMBY pipeline. I don't know that means anything to you, but that's
yeah. I mean, so Freddy Fixer, it's in the book. It's Freddy Fixer was this thing that started in New Haven. I want to say, yeah. And New Haven has a significant Black population. It's also where Yale is. If those two things. Anyone I've never gone to Yale. I mean, I've visited New Haven, but I didn't go to Yale, so I'm don't put that.
Shout out to Hiram and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, both from New Haven. So
oh, I didn't know that. Okay, well there you go. Okay, they got to check it out then. Okay, yeah. I'm interested to know what they think then. But yeah, it's this kind of it's early. Basically, Freddy Fixer is these early one of these early. More formally, I mean, I think the book is arguing like this exists before this in a way, or the sort of tentacles or sort of stuff or essential aspects sort of exist before this. But as a sort of more conventional form, Freddy Fixer is this. I don't know if we don't have the picture. There's a really great picture that I could not get from another book, but it's this anti-littering campaign, kind of a cleaning up the neighborhood campaign that conscripted, and I did a lot of these as a kid. I think you've had people on the show that talk a lot about the Boys and Girls Club and things like that. YMCA, all those kinds of things. It's very much one of those kind of things, like Polite Pal, if you did that, basketball, unfortunately did as a kid. So Freddy Fixer is one of those things that this is a parade, and this is kind of a later version of it, but there was these young kids, actually kind of like the history of the Boy Scouts. If you know the colonial history of the Boy Scouts, it's sort of similar too. But it's like, it was a project that started in the 50s, I want to say, that used model cities funding, which is part of, urban renewal, part of these things that were about blighting Black neighborhoods in order to turn them into sites of speculation and real estate development, which is what we're now living in, right? And Freddy Fixer was one of these things that was about deputizing young Black kids to be Freddy Fixers in their neighborhood. I think, yeah, maybe like the Boy Scouts is a good comparison. And so they would go around picking up litter, maybe they might yell at like someone as a litter bug. And like, basically if we don't want, and the kind of ethos of it was attributed to this very wealthy doctor, but it actually turned out that a lot of the program funding came from the Model Cities Foundation and similar kind of, sort of like the Ford Foundation kind of things for policing communities. The inventor of it, Rich, was kind of describing it as like, well, if we don't clean up our communities, what right have we to complain when we're policed? Or, very conventional, sure, the respectability politics, but I think particularly what I was interested with Freddy Fixer was this idea that the beautification and is also kind of going to the Black Arts Movement question, if the beautification comes from within the community, or within the community, you could put in scare quotes, how does it absolve us of those kinds of problems that we might encounter from the beautification from without? And my answer is no. And that actually in the 50s and 60s, particularly as a response to all the racial riots and movements and things like that that are happening at the time, the Black Power movement, other things, these beautification efforts are a way to inaugurate and indoctrinate, especially Black youth, into cleaning up their neighborhood. And so it also is one of these things where it's kind of a way, it goes back to the Amiri Baraka quote of a unified portrait, and things like that, is that, and I couldn't get the picture from another book, but there's a book called Model Cities that has this photo in it, which I could run and get. And it has like young Black kids, like, proudly walking down the street and, like shout, with sashes that say Freddie Fixer. And then by the time, I think in the book, I forget the picture I used, maybe from the 70s.
Yeah, the one I showed is
It's
from
77.
77.
Yeah. And this is a parade that starts in the 50s, and then it goes to actually very recently to when I don't know if it happened this year. And there's a funny story that I cite in that why it didn't happen. And it was one of these ways to kind of almost seed within Black culture. It was one of these ways to kind of naturalize policing. And so in particular with Freddie Fixer, it became kind of a community tradition, such that if you were like in the 70s and you were like, what is this? Whether you're from the neighborhood, let's say you're from the neighborhood, or let's say you're from outside the neighborhood, they'd be like, oh, this is an old tradition. This is our tradition of cleaning up our communities and making them clean for ourselves, not for white people, right? But the history of it is that it came from these sort of, quite more directly counterinsurgent, if you want to use that term, institutions that were like, how can we get Black people to police themselves and police and beautify their neighborhoods, not because we care about how they live, but so that it can prime them for real estate speculation, right? So, and also another way to think about neoliberalism and getting voluntarist labor from poor Black people that would have previously been, by paid state employees. There's lots of that in it, but I think it's one of those interesting examples because a lot of times the question I'll get with the book is like, well, can we have beautiful things, or something like that? That's a kind of conclusion people, and I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't have you might imagine them, and I haven't. I mean, it's a challenge, but which gets to why, some of the conclusions of the book. But it absolutely kind of confronts this idea that, very common now, that like, oh, you'll see this in the Bay Area, and I'm sure you see it in Philly too, where you see a lot of Black folks, sometimes rich, sometimes not, who are like, oh, fuck gentrification or the police, but they do need to sweep those unhoused people. We do need our neighborhood to be beautiful. We do need, oh, this person was pissing on the street, this person was shooting up on the street. Well, I don't want gentrification, but you can't have that kind of thing. And the point that this kind of brings up in the book to also to the YIMBY aspect, which we could talk about, I can define for people that if you're longtime listeners, you've encountered the term, but is that beautification of our neighborhoods, or this kind of project of beautification is this kind of policing and this regulation turn it. And it's a way of, it has to be questioned about, and I would often say it's never anything but this, whether it's priming the neighborhood for someone else, a kind of future person that it's not you. They don't want you to live there anymore. So I think that the YIMBY pipeline thing is also a reference to the fact that that's a lot of the ways YIMBY movements, I think actually from the jump, ingratiated themselves to poor communities of color was by saying, well, okay, you might not want luxury condos in your neighborhood, but don't you want clean sidewalks? Don't you want litter patrol? Don't you want a garden that, a community garden, which is usually, I mean, there are real community gardens to an extent, but like, well, or maybe, I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't want to say I'm not an expert on community gardens, but because it also is like, who doesn't belong in the community type of thing. But, they're always about presenting the positive fruits of a kind of beautification as if they're not the Trojan horse of more violent forms of displacement and speculation. And they just always are. Like, and it's like, there might, again, someone in the chat might be like, well, actually this, but someone put junior spies or something. But yeah, it very much was like a snitch patrol. It very much was. And, you can look at kind of things like the history of litter, the idea behind Freddie Fixer that like, oh, black neighborhoods are blighted, or I'm putting in quotes, or dirty in quotes, I'm putting, as if that's because, oh, just black people aren't, again, we go back to the civilization logic, are uncivilized and they're not clean. It's like, first of all, if you've ever been to a white person's house, you know they're not more clean than us. But of all, you know, it's like, no, this is structural abandonment. These are all these, you know, all these kind of terms we would understand neoliberalism as. And that part of this also gets to the period in the book that I talk about a little bit, but don't talk about a lot, like in the 70s, is like, this is part of this kind of hustle mentality that becomes just inextricable from black art. I don't know that it could exist without the internalization of this logic that, you know, you make beautiful things out, you gotta, you know, you gotta marketize yourself. You have to turn yourself into a regulated and regulatable project before you can make any real complaints. I mean, why are you, you know, and not to mention that we don't even need to get into the so-called real political work, because what we can do is hustle our way out of this. You know, we can have voluntarist free black police. It's just, there's a lot of things into it, because of course you don't want to pay you don't want to pay, I mean, we're neither of us is arguing for paying black people to police black neighborhoods. Actually, just don't do that. But it's a very fascinating thing. And if you look at like Lester K. Spence's Knocking the Hustle that came out some years ago, I remember meeting him. He's very nice and talked about this with me, where it's like, yeah, you know, the response to that with things like YIMBYism, and it goes back earlier, is like voluntary trash patrols, voluntary neighborhood watch, you know, all these kind of things that are basically carry a more insidious version and logic of the policing. And I think one of the reasons they're more insidious is because, to go back to Baraka, they kind of are able to seed it in the cultural in a way where people growing it, you could be young enough or just, you know, whatever, and think, oh, this is natural. Like, it is actually part of our culture to police this, to not have unhoused people, not have drugs, not have what, da 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 da. And, you know, you go back to the blues, for example, that's why I think that period is interesting. It's like, that's not really the ethos of that period, you know, whereas this becomes, to this day, a still very dominant way of looking at this. So that's what, I don't know if I explained Freddie Fixer well, but yeah, and it's a parade that celebrates that, basically, but it also is a person, a kid usually could win Freddie Fixer things. And the picture's not in the book, but a lot of times these parades, like most parades, they would have the kids marching with police too. So they would like show them like, see, you're like a little, someone said junior spies in the comments, like, yeah, it would be literally like kids like, see, you're almost like a policeman. Good work. Good. You know, you're making the neighborhood beautiful, which I think is also not just a thing we should use to think about what the kids are doing, but a way to think about what cops are doing, right? As also part of a beautification project, which also complicates the celebration of beauty as something more important than us.
Yeah, I forget the I can't remember the name of the person who comes up with the phrase, but like that the dirt is matter out of place, right? And so yeah, no, there's this whole connection with, you know, like beautification or removing dirt is actually about taking things out that don't belong, right? And so then the question, you know, becomes like, well, what do you do with people who don't belong, right? And you know, and yeah, I mean, I know when it came up in the two-part conversation with Tariq Khan around settler colonialism. But yeah, anyway, go ahead.
The last thing I'll say is, I think that's what I think about beauty, is that it's actually about, it's its own construction of belonging. And I think that's what's dangerous about it. And speak a little more concretely, and I talk about Goncalves as someone who writes about this and is like, well, what is black beauty? And he has this interesting theorization of it, but it is ultimately, to your point, it's like, well, who belongs? You know, I talk a lot about it, which feels like a very like Kant or a Kantian sentence. He talks about the rose being plucked as beautiful. And I think it's about that plucking. It's about that power gesture. Go back to the minstrel stage and, you know, blacking up is like, it's about the power of that gesture, which is anti-relational in this kind of way, you know, in a more complicated way. And that's the difficulty of beauty. And but yeah, go ahead.
No, appreciate that. Thank you. So I do want to talk about, because there are some like collectives and organizations that you look at within the Black arts movement that you think of as, and maybe this can connect also to a conversation around, you know, like kind of what, because, you know, I think I hope people have gotten through this conversation, and it'd be interesting to hear your kind of thoughts on it. But you're not saying like black people shouldn't make things, right? Or that there shouldn't
Yeah.
be like right, like it's not an anti um creativity,
Yeah.
kind of discussion, right? Like
Yeah.
it's
Something.
really about, what is meant by the aesthetic, and what is the role of the black artist and black art within this society, and what does it justify, and what kind of
Mhm.
comportment does it require, and all of these kind of things. um and so there are groups that you look at too within the book that you draw inspiration from, or think, are short-lived but, cool projects in terms of trying to do something different. And so I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about Afra Cobra, and is it Obasi? Is that how it's pronounced, or Obasi? I'm not
Obasha. I thought
sure.
it was pronounced Obasha, but it
Obasha.
might not be. I think the
Okay.
C is pronounced like a Sha. Yeah, I think so.
I
But
don't know.
yeah.
Yeah. So, or any other groups that, and examples from the Black arts movement that you kind of, found really interesting this way, in terms of trying, partly the question that you brought up earlier of like some frame of accountability, and some frame of
Mhm.
like, not just, okay, we're just going to do this for ourselves, and, who cares what anybody thinks about it, kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. The In the last chapter, I think the groups that I primarily talk about the Black Artist Group of St. Louis, which is really interesting because they have a much more embattled relationship. Like they do take some of the funding from like the model cities, um, and they're very quickly they're like given a space by, we'll just say like the government, government private foundation funding, we'll just say that, to create a artist space for themselves. So they get to, kind of every artist's dream, I think, who's not a millionaire, right? Having our own space to make stuff. Um, and they get the space after a lot of argumentation because they're actually pretty aware of what these funds are supposed to do. And so at the same time they're being offered these funds, the Pruitt-Igoe strike is going on. And people are probably fairly familiar with it, right? It's this huge, the biggest rent strike, I think, still in the history of the US, for better conditions and, like better living conditions in Pruitt-Igoe, which was a housing project in St. Louis, like in and around St. Louis, and they they're very hesitant to take the money to have do any sort of artistic work because they realize that it's, I think in Amelia Cruz or one of them says something like, oh, this is like they wanted us to civilize people, because these people who were striking and pissed off about their poor living conditions are actually um, in need of, again, going back to the slavery, in need of civilizing because they're not acting right, whatever. And so they met about it, they debated, and then eventually they agreed to take some of the money or take the money and created a space. And then they created the space and were like, oh, we can perform. A lot of them were kind of experimental musicians, maybe would call them, in the line of like the AACM, which is also a group I talk about. Which the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, people probably know about from Chicago. The AACM actually met about getting these kinds of funds and refused to take them, at least at this point in the 60s, which is interesting. I think that um, one short answer to the concerns is like, you can just not do something. You can not get something, there's that quote from James Baldwin. I don't think I ended up getting to put it in the book, praise like, you have to lose something. This is going to cost you everything. That house, that child of yours, they're not yours. You have to give up something. I'm paraphrasing. Sorry, I can't. It's a really good quote. But yeah, so it's also like about giving stuff up, which I think is often a difficult argument to get into with Black people, even though ironically a lot of the Black people who are artists are from more affluent backgrounds, especially fine artists. But maybe with music it's a little more complicated. Um, so they create a space outside in St. Louis, or maybe slightly outside, and they invite the Pruitt-Igoe strikers, like, hey, why don't you, maybe they're passing out flyers or something, I forget, like, why don't you come see art in our space? And they're like, the people who are striking are like, no, we don't really care for that, but can we use your space to meet for our political meetings? And I thought that was actually really like a really good like way to respond. And they're like, oh sure, yeah, you can use our space for having meetings. Like, I think this is like, it's also kind of, it's a small thing, but it's like even just giving up that much was a good thing. It was like, oh, this is not a space for us to reproduce ourselves as Black artists. It's actually a moment where we could, give something away to like Black people who we are theoretically, again, in the spirit of the Black arts movement, interested in, supporting, or I don't want to use the word serve the people, but I know that is that's a common term then that a lot of them use. So I think that's like, that's kind of that's one example I think is sort of interesting. And then there is Afrocober is interesting also. I think starts out as Obasha, which is a much bigger group, which contains more sort of like, I guess you could say sort of multidisciplinary artists. And Obasha is actually, if I remember correctly, much more driven by theater a little bit more than it is driven by eventually like Afrocoba becomes probably more associated with painting and things like that. But there are a lot of painters in the group. I think there's musicians too, but I'm not off the top of my head remembering. And so, Obasha, we can call them are like many of them are local, they're from Chicago. A lot of these people you can I think quite a few are still around. I don't know if they're still around, but they would have been till very recently. And there's also there's a lot of debates in their sort of artistic production.
Wasn't Abdul Akalimat part of it?
Yeah. Yes, he was part of it.
He's
Yeah,
been on the show.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Oh, cool. Okay, yeah, and he was and I believe he's part of Afrocobra as well. So, sorry, I didn't clarify that. Obasha starts as I think a bigger group. Afrocobra might become bigger later, but it starts and then kind of becomes Afrocobra by, I think I want to say the early 70s or late 60s. And it's interesting because a lot of people credit what people might know this, especially if you live in Chicago, they're credited with kind of starting the 60s mural movement. I mean, there's, this happens in the 30s too, but with sort of socialist murals. But in the 60s, they're sort of credited with starting the sort of modern mural movement that we have in San Francisco in big numbers, right? Like a lot of targeted communities, particularly Black folks, but also a lot of other, Latino folks. But, that also comes from a tradition too in lots of parts of Latin America, but comes from this sort of tradition of creating public murals. And they're very, like they taught. The interesting thing I found, sort of to answer your question too, is also just the most interesting part to me of any of these collectives was the meetings and the like actual discussion about like what are the ethics of these things, like what are we actually doing. And so they made this thing called the Wall of Respect, which was made with the input of people in the community, which on the one hand you listen to that and you're like, oh, that's a common it's a common developer for phrasing, like, oh, we took the concerns of the people in the community into account, da da da. But I think what's interesting is that from the perspective of like kind of art or Black art, right, is that like these are people who made something that it was more about trying to prevent them from demolishing buildings or, from valuing the neighborhood, which at that point, I think the valuing of the neighborhood was in the sort of demolition of huge things. Like you see this, Chicago's a great example of that, like, whole freeways, other things like that they demolish in order to, or roadways and things like that, whole buildings, whole complexes. LA too, sure, would be great. In Oakland actually too. Like, so I think that it was interesting to think about the Wall of Respect, which is not still around to my knowledge, but there are lots of photos of over the years, as a project that they sort of self-consciously took up to defend the neighborhood from being, treated to urban renewal and, I could say gentrified or speculated upon. And so I thought that was an interesting approach to art, as to the extent that art can be a defense of Black people. I thought it was interesting. That's not often the way. And I think, again, we enter in this paradigm with Alain Locke, where most of the time it's about the imaginary project of a defense of a Black people that are not the Black people right here, by the way, for some reason. But that was kind of interesting because it had this material component to it where it was like literally this wall is on a building they're trying to develop. How can we kind of use art to prevent them from demolishing things, which I don't think works now, but yeah. So those are two examples, and I talked about the ACM a lot too. But yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to pull up the Wall of Respect, and then I couldn't get to the unmute button. um, all right, let me pull it up actually though, so people can see it. And yeah, we have a huge. I mean, I'm in the Philly area, and there's the Philly Arts mural project. But anyways, there's murals all over the place in Philly.
Yeah, here
Um,
too.
yeah, this is
Yeah,
this is the wall of respect.
yeah. And I think what's interesting is that it was called respect, but it also, I mean, there are interesting things too, like organizing groups held meetings in front of it or like outside, which is also interesting to think of a group that, I don't know, like people that, political groups that meet outside. I think that's kind of cool. Like, so there's I could go into it more about it for long on time, but there's some interesting, if people check in the book and, there's a lot of books written by Obasha Afrikoba artists. So I encourage you to read those as well. And they talk about like all the things that happened around the wall of respect. And like, I want to say someone got killed. I don't know if it was by the police in front of it. And then that became kind of a conversation. Like, so, there's some interesting things in there that are a little more interesting than which I guess just a little opening. I'm not like, do this and it will change, create a revolution or whatever. But I think they're interesting moments to think about.
Right on. So I'm gonna pull up a couple different things people asked about along the way. If you have, do you have it? Do you have time? I don't want to presume upon
Sure.
your
I'm just
time at
hanging
this point.
around. We got this
All
is
right,
people listen to this while they're on the job. Is that how it works?
they do. Yes. We help them get through their shifts. That's the way it goes. All right, where was the question? Oh yeah, so Justin had a couple of good questions. So, curious about the relationship between limits of Black art in its being used to sell, to validate Black people in a white imaginary, and symphonies, museums being
Hmm.
used to civilize Euro immigrants in the late 20th and late 19th and early
Yeah.
20th century. And then is it partly in arts history? I'm not sure if that's connected to that question or not. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Someone said I'm for the people in the chat. That's so quick. That's so sweet. Um, yeah, I mean, I would answer yes. I think that's also something the book is trying to both those questions. Is that so? If you look, it's kind of interesting at the history. There's a lot written about this. I'll try to answer succinctly. The phonograph is interesting because in the US in the late 19th, early 20th century, one of the selling points of the phonograph and why they want to use it for music, contrary to like Edison wanted it to be like a which is its own fascinating thing. He wanted to like be the secretary, right, and stuff, because we could go into that, the sort of invisibilized, feminized labor. But uh, they wanted it to kind of, to use that a term, or sort of what that was referencing the question, like sort of like edifying youth. Very simple. It's really an 18th century idea. I mean, I talk a lot about Friedrich Schiller in this. If people have ever read Schiller's writings, I mean, he's a very famous playwright, German playwright. But you know, the aesthetic refinement that goes back to, let's at least say, the 18th century is very much present in the late 19th and early 20th century in a broad kind of way too. And so the phonograph, they think in the US, one of the marketing points ploys, one of, not the only one, but one of the marketing ploys becomes, well, this is how we will um, refine our population, mass civilize our, which I think is alluded to in the question. And I think there's definitely a relationship to that. And there are other versions of the work where I looked at where I was like, talk a little bit about the relationship between that and the fact that you have blackface recordings going on at the same time as it. So that even though the minstrel stage, which is the obvious reference for those recordings, is looked at not as a form of like high or refined art, but being, having that kind of racialized power over Black people is absolutely part of having a kind of refined relationship to art. So, as was the case with the minstrel stage in the 19th century, you could be a rich white person, go to the minstrel stage, and then later that evening you hit up a symphony. Like it's not, or the next day, whatever. Those are not, they're opposed forms, and they're opposed or they are symbolically opposed forms, but they cohabitate in the same, people kind of project of subject production, or whatever we want to kind of call it, self-making, just that term from Sadie Hartman. So I think it's absolutely related. And then I think there is something about art, and y'all talked about, I think the beginning of film also answers this question very concretely too. Like there is this sense that in the late 19th, early 20th century, America, to compete with Europe in a kind of as an emerging imperial power, has to have its own music, American music. And, people who have studied the history of so-called jazz, or so-called jazz, a lot of musicians rejected the term jazz, can think about the way, for example, that jazz becomes, as well as the sort of popular front things in the 30s, I talk a little bit about this too, becomes a way to create this kind of coherent American culture, American music that is very much also part of what was um, asked in the question. And then and yeah, and also I don't talk about film a lot in the book. I do watch a lot of film, but I think interestingly with film and like what was that? I want to say it's maybe it's the 20s when you start to see all these actual regulatory bodies get invented, right? Which is very much the term alone. Like I forget the name, but they're called like regulatory bodies. So you kind of get this idea that these sort of modes of artistic production need to be entrained to teach people to regulate, or they will be regulated, or both. I mean, really both happening at the same time. So I think there's actually a lot of relationship, and I do think that's part of the book. I kind of push against some of the romance of Black music in it, that like people have. I talk about the sort of expressionist or expressivist tendency, right? Like that you see in the 19th century, that Black music is always an expression of our suffering, or always an expression of sort of more immediate emotions. And that's not to say that doesn't happen or that's not in there, but it's difficult once you look at actually making music, because it's not how people make music. I mean, generally. And then it does allow for this sort of civilizational differentiation between how Black subjects are formed and everybody else. And I'm less interested, I don't know if this answers the question, but it's worth talking about too. I'm less interested in kind of the inheritance of slavery just as our inheritance, rather than it being like, this is the world's inheritance. Like the world did this to us. I mean, I wasn't personally enslaved, but the Black folks, and that is kind of the way it ought to be taken up with respect to art, rather than it being the private possession of. Yeah, so I don't know if that really answered the question, but that's also where that kind of comes from. So there definitely is a kind of connection to other groups in a way. Yeah.
Appreciated. Yeah, and Justin's still in the chat. So Justin, if you have a follow-up, or if there was a piece of that we didn't get, then feel free to let us know. Is an interesting question. So Marlo, we did not talk about Emory Douglas. This is an interesting thing that came up, as I was listening to you today. Really, I didn't think to ask you about this question beforehand, right? But it is somewhat of a choice to talk about the Black arts movement. And then another choice would be to talk about someone like Douglass, or how like the Panthers used art. And I think it's interesting. I mean, because obviously for one, there's specific context for Douglass, right? In that he's a member of an organization that has a political program, and his art is specifically, and I don't mean this in a negative term, it's for propaganda purposes, but it's to promote the ideas and the analysis and images that will draw people into the party, that will help communicate the politics of the party, etc. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And then I guess part of the question related to what you talk about in the book is how maybe we still have, in certain ways, the artistic portion of Emory Douglass, in terms of represent, this like what maybe sort of the question of like what lives on from the 60s and the 70s in terms of the art, and what is lost, right? And like I would say that if you're an Emory Douglass and you're not in some sort of political movement, organization, collective, etc., then I think there are real limits to what you can do as an artist to some extent. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that answers it. That's a great question. And I thought I would get that more often, because I think some people could move from this. Although I think it's a little, I hope I kind of, headed it off. And it's like, then is my argument a kind of utilitarian art that purely, I don't believe in this kind of stuff. I mean, if you've ever done political organizing, how to get people to do things, I have no idea. You try. A podcast, like people are trying. So if we knew, if even just a basic level of like class, not to say that class is not woven in through all these other things, how to get people to, just basically recognize that I don't, we try different things. But so I wouldn't say I have that view of subjectivity, but I was thinking based on this, would people think, oh, I'm, sort of secretly saying there should be a kind of utilitarian function of the art that like it's party delegated or something? I'm not, I'm an anarchist. I've been on the show before, so no, no way. But I'm a black anarchist, so, but but I do think what you said is exactly true, Emory Douglas. And I think the other thing, living in the Bay long enough, I lived for almost 20 years, like there isn't a shortage of the slogans of the Black Panthers or the imagery or any of these things. It kind of goes back to that Baraka quote. We have a plentitude of those. I think, and I actually think this goes to the core argument of the book, is that there's actually a way in which, and I think we've talked about this on the show before in some way, and you've definitely had other people, that actually holds back our political imaginations in a certain way, because people are thinking like, oh, well, I have the slogans, we could go back to Kant, I have the understanding, I have the kind of faculties, I have this rationalized understanding of all this kind of project. But as you alluded to, I think the thing that's gone is the collectives, is the people. And I'm not saying there probably are some, well, there are some collectives, but I'm sure some, people will be like, oh, there's this, but we don't have those kind of, you could call them parties, you can go whatever. I mean, I don't, I believe in a many approaches thing. I'm sure different parties that I wouldn't perfectly agree with would have done some amazing stuff, or artists for that matter. So it is to your point that what my experience was, that I kind of alluded to earlier, is that even just telling people not to do art for a condo or a tech company was unthinkable. Like, so I think what made someone like an Emory Douglas strong, is a strong or interesting example, was the collectivity that's happening behind the scenes. And I think that's where a lot of things are interesting. I mean, we could even look at things, again, I don't super go into the 70s, but there are some interesting things about like the LA Rebellion in terms of filmmakers, which is very influential for me. And I'm sure, I know you've been two man on the show a lot, probably, I'm gonna guess, is a big fan of, like, so there are lots of examples of, that are more interesting, and also why I kind of do point to forms of collectivity, in a different way, the blues, but it's not the same kind of, self-conscious political project. But I think that is a more powerful place to start for me, which I just see as totally absent in, not exclusively, but I do think, an increasingly individuated conception of an artist, which I do think we live in that world now. So yeah, it is exactly what you alluded to in the question, that, he had these parties, these groups, that he's belonging to, like if you looked up ACT UP, there's lots of things that have interesting artistic examples. Yeah. But
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I've talked to Two Black about this stuff a little bit too, and him within poetry and stuff like that. And like I think at one point he talked about the myth that like, people would have a line in their poetry of like, I'm going to write the poem that's going to start the revolution, right? Or this kind of, right? And so like the idea that people have, right, that it's like if they just write or paint or make the kind of like that
the right thing.
yeah, that like somehow what's missing is just the quality and the craftsmanship around like revolutionary messaging, I guess you could
Yeah.
say, of a certain kind, right? Without, people accountability, like, all of these kind of
Yeah.
pieces. Like, I know it's a tricky question to ask you, talk about the Panthers as an anarchist, but like,
Oh no, I
um,
mean, no.
yeah, yeah, but I mean, I think that's important, right? Is it's sort of like
Yeah.
some sort of political home, political accountability,
Yeah.
right? For like what you are doing as an artist, and then not to just be, I mean, we could talk about it within podcasting or anything else. Like a lot of what we have these days are um, not accountable to some
Yeah.
sort of like base or group of people that and maybe if it is, it's like people you don't even know, right? So then it's like,
Yeah.
well, what does that
What does
mean?
accountability mean? Yeah, there. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, all right, let's see. Everything in San Francisco concerning the Black community is counterinsurgent, small, isolated community ripe for experimentation on many levels by empire. Working with students and families, you can really see it. Um, see. I loved this comment, Shitty Matcha. It is, unfortunately, we don't have written records of the first impressions of the colonized upon encountering and observing Europeans. It would probably blow their settler minds.
Sure.
um, yeah, I like this comment too. When white people sound extra sciency, analytical, with a lot of big words to express the most odious racism is sometimes weirdly funny. I agree. That was in relation to the Brazil segment.
Yeah.
This question: if revolutionary art is linked with a conscious movement and organization that has an ideological base, program demands, and political education, it can be powerful. I didn't know if you knew this reference. What
Yeah.
Du Bois says about, yeah. Do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I talk about that essay in the beginning of it, and yeah, he talks about, and he uses that also. Why I don't criticize the word, he in that essay he says something. I'm not gonna paraphrase his very pretty 1926, I think the essay is from, language, where he's like, I've everything I have created has been for propaganda. He says something to that effect. And so there's there's someone who I think reviewed the book. I think it was offered extremely helpful comments. I think it was Naomi Chandler, who was very sweet. Thank you if that was you. And he was like, big Du Bois expert. And he was like, he pointed out this essay and he was like, I don't know if anything you're saying, and this is beyond that essay, which was funny because it was written exactly 100 years ago now. I think it was 1926. And that essay is really, I talk a lot about that, of it being like, his argument is like, the Negro artist is doing these things for a kind of white outsider, that it is, there is not a core to what, there is no sort of positive definition of the Black artist that is not about creating these kinds of cultural ambassadorial sort of projects towards an outside other. And so I kind of agree with that. Like, I think, and maybe I would push even further into say, like, even, there's that line in the book too, where I'm like, even without ourselves or even amongst ourselves kind of thing, where I think that is such a deeply ingrained notion now 100 years later in the conception of the Black artist, that there is always this kind of there is always this tendency towards a kind of justification, and it goes back to that quote, the other question too that you said about, like, if you have a revolutionary program and then you make art. I mean, I don't, like, it also gets to that question of, like, are people these, kind of vessels that you can communicate? Language doesn't work that way, so I don't know why art would, whatever we're calling art. But I think it is the question of, like, almost something that goes beyond the justificatory. And I do think that collectivity is something like that. It's somewhere like that, to the demand that we always organize ourselves, get organized, whatever type of way one wants to frame it. That I think there's a lot of arguments to be made that, in a kind of relationality, something like the Black artist doesn't exist, and that's the way you move beyond this perpetually, that Du Bois talks a lot about, this perpetually kind of justificatory, or that the way that the denigration of something like propaganda, or the opposition of propaganda to real art, that kind of thing that opposition doesn't emerge or doesn't cohere entirely, because there are not these sort of counter institutions that have almost always, at least in the 20th century, mostly almost always existed, or all of our lives, I'm going to say, unless anyone's over 120 years old. That I think that is something like a way to push that conversation. But yeah, I that Du Bois essay is really good. People should it's free online. It's 100 years old, so it should be free, and it's pretty short. And that was a big turning point in the book, because I think it was Naomi Chandler recommended it, was like, you need to read this. And yeah, I think it's a challenge, and it is, like, in a way also inspiring to be like, oh, they were still dealing with this 100 years ago. I mean, it could go the opposite too. You could be like, Jesus, why is this? But yeah, so that's, yeah, it is, and so there is like in him a little like Larry Neal, more of an attention to a kind of accountability, like, it's not just about this, not only individual pursuit, but also, to that earlier point, like a kind of eternal objective project of art, that exists beyond us conveniently, even though it often is used against us or exists against us. Because what do we do with that?
Yeah, no, thank you. Somebody brought up there's also an element of voyeurism when playing for primarily white audiences, whether it's expressing a radical view or not. I've had to come to terms with that. Claps feel consuming. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things you don't, I mean, you do deal with it in terms of the justificatory, like the justifying to without as well as to within. But I think one of the things that I really found, and I mean, they're related actually, right? Because like this so I really liked the fact that one of the places that you focus around is imaginations, right? And around
Mm-hmm.
like how it kind of causes its own, there's these own processes of self-regulation of, okay, like if I'm going to, and thinking about this and going all the way back to like Douglass, right? And saying like, okay, in this era, if I'm going to be a black artist, like these are the kind of justificatory pieces I need to take on, or like whatever, like this is what this looks like. This is how it
Mm-hmm.
needs to look in a certain way, right? And then of course with the Harlem Renaissance, just the interesting of like kind of in like, well, if we don't want white people to tell us how it has to look, then we need to, as our own community, decide how it
Mm-hmm.
needs to look, which is interesting, right? Like it is very interesting. And you can see value to that to a certain degree. But I think this is always a problem. Like this is something that Dr. Jared Ball talks about quite a bit, right? Of like anyone who um, is in the United States that is looking to become like a mainstream artist, right? Or a very or just to play in different parts of the country or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, right? Like you have to come to terms with the fact that you're creating something largely for white folks, right? And so then like how do you navigate that? And I think that's it's a complicated and difficult question. Like he recently had a good discussion about Chappelle's recent Netflix thing. Um but like, and it was a good commentary on it, of he uses this discussion of the Cosby effect with relation to Chappelle. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean that question of like of audience, I guess, is one you don't spend a whole lot of time, I didn't feel like in the piece discussing that question or thinking about that question deeply.
Yeah, no, I think so because I think there's a lot of theories like audience reception theories and things, but I think it's also one of the things the book also tries to complicate too, right? I mean, you can look at the history of Black art, and that's also why the Harlem Renaissance is really important, but also the Black arts movement too is also like, even in periods where the art was aimed at a Black artist, I mean, the Harlem Renaissance is the most obvious example. People know the history of things like slumming it and the Cotton Club, all these places, right? Like, it's like even when, or perhaps especially when it's Black ruling class people or the Black elite, to use that, that phrasing, that are kind of, either the dominant audience or the dominant producer or the, like that, there's really just a step away from white people being in the picture, even if we're to think of it that way. And it's an interesting, it's an interesting thing too. I mean, dude, I would have a lot more to say for something like film, and I think it's really interesting because it's also one of these things where like I think why a lot of black movies are bad, including a lot of African films too, is because there's like this festival audience, there's like this outside audience. Um, but I also think it's one of those things that's interesting is that again, I'll try not to go into film too much 'cause I don't write about it in the book, but it is one of those things to me I think about a lot when I think about contemporary Black film, where I'm like, people might think that their audience is not Black, but I'm like, what about the form, or their audience is Black, sorry, but like, what about the forms? Where do we get these forms of kind of, like, and what do we get the why behind these forms, which gets into the justification aspect, so like, is, one thing a lot of artists during the Harlem Renaissance, and also although this is more of a point of contention, but I think especially in the 60s, and I mean, I very much grew up with this, much later, was like taking African elements from music, or from, let's say, your descendant, I'm not neither my parents or grandparents were born in Africa. Like, you know, let's say using African is the content of the art a way to produce the form and a way to produce the audience? But then that enters into this whole complex matrix. Whereas, like, if you're talking to African, you know, an African audience or I don't really like the word diaspora, because, you know, an audience that's Black people in the U.S., Caribbean, New World, and, you know, African folks on the continent, whatever people want to characterize it. I think there's also the question of what sorts of demands, what sorts of critiques, what sorts of worlds you're negating and bringing to the fore. That is, you know, endlessly kind of a question. And that was that was a big issue in the Harlem Renaissance too, especially for, you know, like Francophone Caribbean, Francophone African artists and reggae. So I think for me, it was more a way to talk about, and I say this in the intro, I think, like, the imagination of the slave society, and to talk about, like, well, this is the audience. And I think a tendency a lot of Black folks can do, you know, maybe including myself, and I think very commonly the Black bourgeoisie do, which I think kind of is like, well, that's not me. I'm not, you know, it's not appropriation if I take it. And of course, we have a lot of Black cultural forms that, again, you go back to Frederick Douglass, that are appropriated by white people because a Black person did it first, who was, you know, in most cases of the ruling class that had the means to do it. And so I think talking about the imagination of the slave society, which is a term I use, and I say, like, the imagination of the slave society is a material site from which Black aesthetic justification is forged and reified. So it's also a way to, it's a challenge. It's like, we can't just opt out by saying, like, well, I'm Black, I don't do that, you know, or I'm like, because I just think that is too easy, and it's just not true. You know, like, it's like, and I think that's where it kind of, it also enters a kind of ethical political question about, like, you can't make this art outside the world, which I think also starts to get into those sort of arguments around audience. And probably everyone has an audience in their head when they make some kind of art, but then how you engage that. And also, it's, you know, there's a lot of worth, again, going back to the 60s too, the Black arts movement really influenced the text. I went as one of the other starting points, since that's what I learned about when I was a teenager and in college. I think influenced me in making art, is like, you know, there is this conversant with people like Brecht and other people about breaking down the audience and not having audience and having, you know, expansive participation. And that's the thing I get into, where I'm like, I think that was a good move, to put it simply, and interesting and really powerful. And then I also think about the idea that, look at, like, you know, if ever people have ever read, like, Richard Eiton's Search of the Black Fantastic, like, it's also a fascinating to think that part one response to that is inaugurating every Black person into being this sort of spectacular aesthetic subject that's always producing, you know, now we have the term viral content, you know, or content like on. So it's a challenge. I think it's not so much an issue of a white audience, although obviously in ways I think people have criticized and are even just casually aware of, it's that, but also of a kind of relationship, a relationality to being in the world that would need an audience as a way to resolve the complicated questions around this kind of thing, or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think the last question I'll bring up, because it might enable us to talk about this and some related things, right? Somebody said what it's also tricky now as a liberation
Yes.
artist wanting to do exclusively community funding arts is there's a great deal of private and public partnership funding. And I think, you know, this is sort of like kind of in a certain way where you kind of start and end the book to some, you know, to some degree,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is like thinking about this problem that of where we are now, right? Where if you're gonna be funded as an artist, I mean, like a great example of this, um, well, maybe it's not. It's an example that I think is good. Is you know, when Chuck D did the like ambassador thing for like the State Department, right, in the middle
Yeah.
of the Gaza genocide, right, and was like, you know, out there with Anthony Blinken and, you know, all of this. Um, the Gaza genocide, of course, is still ongoing. I'm not saying it's in the past, but you know, this was under the Biden administration, and it it was Chuck D, of course, but there was also a whole, like, it was a program. These were like music
Mm-hmm.
ambassadors for the State Department, right? So it's government money, enough to pay. So, you know, and I think in many cases it was like whatever, $60,000 a year plus travel. Like, so it's like something that for artists is not, life-changing money necessarily, right? But it's like, oh, I know how I'm gonna get paid for the year, and I can tour and do this and da da da.
Hmm.
It's like, yeah, and you're doing this on behalf of the State Department, right? And I mean, maybe there's always been stuff like that, by the way. Like, of course, there's been all of these programs, funded by the Congress of Cultural Freedom and the State Department and the CIA and all of this kind of stuff. But that's like kind of the spectacular example. There's a lot
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
of like, within cities, like, mayoral budgets, nonprofit money. If you're in a place like you are in the Bay Area, then there's, tech money and all of this stuff. Um, and it is, I acknowledge it's a very difficult like landscape, I think, for
Hmm.
artists of any kind to navigate nowadays
Hmm.
if you are trying to make a livelihood off of, doing art. Um and so yeah, I don't know if there's any closing kind of things that you would want to say about all of that. But I think the book, particularly for folks, since you can download it and look at it, like the preface and the conclusion, like you're really kind of looking at some of these questions too. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So very quickly, the Chuck D thing that actually goes back. People probably know this. I don't know if it entered the chat, but there was a called the Real Ambassadors of Jazz, which is this. I don't know if you've talked about it on the show. I wouldn't be surprised if not. That I want to say it was made as a record. I actually have the record, like, and it's I want to say like Dave Brubeck, Louis Armstrong. So it was this period, and it was like a Cold War project by the U.S. Very similar to what you're describing. I want to say when I was in college in like the 2000 somethings, there was also they tried to do this with hip hop. Um, I don't remember. I want to say like it didn't have super famous artists. I don't remember who was in it, but this was like maybe 15 more than 15 years ago. Um, so that does happen. Yeah, it is, there is much more overt State Department funded projects like that. And, I mean, less so with, I'm not even just with black folks, but a lot of, I mean, film festivals. I mean, the Berlin Film Festival, there's all this, that are like, for anti-con, all these kinds of things are very overt. Um, but yeah, so your question was about funding and I mean, I really think and if you make, I mean, it would be interesting to see what, like someone like because I think film is a great example where it's I don't want to say it is expensive because people always say that it can be expensive. I think it can just be time consuming, which I think is the other leaning towards the answer is like how we choose to spend our time is something in some cases we have control over, even if it takes longer to do it. And versus like say what we make money from, which we have far less control over. Um, so it's true. Something like I think of like a lot of film, it's like very impossible for them to get funded by things that aren't one of these sources that you brought up. And but I also think, you know, one way to do these kinds of things is also not to make money. I mean, it's sort of an obvious answer, it's like I there I think it's kind of where you start to go into the collectivity and it's like, okay, how can we sustain ourselves and make these things, which is a very political question. I think that's like what political, we I think we did an episode with you, I want to say, or maybe it might have been on San Francisco where we talked about like this argument that I think people my generation had, probably because of how naturalized nonprofits were, that you should get paid for doing organizing. And it was like, well, okay, you do that, you're not going to be able to unorganize the structures of power that are paying you. It's very simple, like, um, and you can look at even labor organizing like that. Even though you're organizing your job, they're not paying you to organize against the job to the extent that So there's I think that's where we enter into the kinds of questions around the political and the other thing I kind of did in the book was also try to think about or kind of leave open the spaces for art that are not as valued and that I tend to kind of attack the sites that are more the sites of value production, so like now a lot of people probably deal with this if you live in a city is like contrary to the 60s, I think to a degree, is like a lot of murals are used to gentrify places. So it's like, what do we make of the kind of the way public art, the public of public art is now constituted by a new kind of theft, or a double theft, or however we want to look at it, that's like very much wielded against, which I guess we must consider Black folks outside the public then, if these public art is being used against Black, particularly poor, working class people, sex workers, unhoused folks. I think not taking those kind of things, and I think it's also a way to look at how we give up and find each other. It is very really, I just, like how we give up those resources that you highlighted and kind of find each other and other things. And a lot of things are like this, but I think a lot about film and how people need a film to look a certain way, or like have a certain quality to be, or, they need art to be polished. This is actually, I think, a really big problem in Black art, where people can't make, like, you look at, like, if you go to film, you can think of like Haile Gerima, all these, all these kind of filmmakers who are making films that looked rough, but they're still better than anything that's made now by Black filmmakers in the US at least, and Africa, honestly. Like, but films look better now. Like they look, this goes to the beauty thing. Like, I mean, it's easier to make a, so I think it's like, okay, well, looking, it doesn't have to be just looking backwards, but I think that is the way they frequently looked as a negative, right? It was always like, oh, if we don't do this, lest we return to slavery type of thing. I think looking back at, like, and I'm just picking film because I think it's the one where an aesthetic maybe is the most, always is conflated with getting these kinds of resources. And I'm like, well, yeah, but Bush Mama or, Ashes and Embers is better than any Black American film, big, whatever, the kind of, those kind of, the famous, that very polished, unfortunately, clearly very Tree of Life, Terrence Malick influence looking Black film that produced everywhere. There's a lot of queer films like that too, Black queer films. So I think there's something to be said when people say they need resources too. It's like a question of, like, what are you doing and what are you building and what do you, and how can we get there together type of thing, versus which people are more inclined to do with maybe sort of a so-called political thing, but less inclined to do with art because it's supposed to be this private possession of us, which is weird if you make music, because musicians aren't necessarily that way, and it's impossible if you make film, in my opinion, or do theater. I think it's harder to do that kind of thing and be like, this is my private possession. It must be this, and it can't. Anyway, so I don't know. That's one sort of answer.
No, it's good. I think that, these are really difficult, questions. I think the thing that you talked about in terms of even the will that people have, right, to actually want to do something different, right? Like that's a big part of it too. Like what you talked about, like trying to form artist collectives and stuff like that. Like, and
Yeah.
it's not just artists, like, but it is an example, of the way that, I think just I don't want to give it just to like our generation and the generations that follow, but like, there is something to just how hyper individuated
Mm-hmm.
we've become, and obviously that's something that has been really violently imposed through all
Yeah.
kinds of media and other things, right? To like sort of put us in this place of like, I mean, it goes back to the, as you said, this is where the neoliberal logics that you talked about, like, you can see when you go back to something like, Douglas, or these early, like these kind of 19th, late 19th century, early 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
logics of like, when you start talking about self-regulating, individuals and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, this
And
is, yeah,
last
go
thing
ahead.
is like, I think that's where art is really important, because I think if we look at art as just expressive and expression and all these kinds of those sort of paradigms, it becomes unthinkable that art is this point of self-regulation. And so, for example, like, let's say I'm like a filmmaker, and I'm like, I want to make a film and it has to be made this way. I'm a absolute auteurist, and I think I'm like, I don't know, Kubrick or Preminger or one of those filmmakers who like really was like, I mean, the put the authoritarian in author. Like, I think it says a lot about why one thinks that that's like that. If that can be carried in expression, then what is expression doing there? And it goes to your thing, like, of how is what I need to be the product of the film, even itself, regulatory in this sense? And like, how do you give up, you know, I'm using theater because I'm making a film with some Hutosho who's on here sometimes, and I think a lot of it, and there are filmmakers who would, you know, like like who Simbene who's one of my favorite filmmakers. You know, he worked with regular people, and he had to just be like, they're doing this, you know. So I think there is some models and things like theaters. I mean, a lot of theater, and it's also because we don't have that, you know, those are things that people I think maybe are a little less hip to, like the records of those things. But and I go to the blues. I mean, a lot of it is like there's a lot of this being collective production that I'm not saying it's a solution to all this, but it gets you into these places where it's a little more complicated to reassert what are some of the problems, I think. You know, it's not saying we're not going to find new problems. You know, there is no, again, if you think of it kind of dialectically, we have to come at, or among other analytically, other kinds of ways to think about it, you have to kind of confront these things. But I think there are lots of, you know, it's kind of that giving up that we associate with other political choices, but we don't can think about with art, because for some reason that's supposed, and that's very 19th century, that's Nietzsche. I don't think that's radical. Like, I think that's very much like that art is the one last protected thing, whereas giving up where you get your coffee from or whatever isn't, you know. I would be confused as to why I would, that's romantic thinking. We'd have to like think about that with ourselves, like why is that the one thing that is off limits in that way. And I don't think that's where we came from, so to speak, with Black music. So yeah. Oh yes,
No,
thank you.
awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to remind people, especially if folks missed early on, you know, that Gemma is, you know, wanted to have us plug and support this mutual
Yes,
aid project.
please do.
So, you know, folks, this is a program in Gaza, right, that is run by Palestinians in Gaza, and as well as folks, you know, in the
In
US
the
and other
Shatat.
places, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, yeah, the link to this is in the show description, as is the link to download this book, which, you know, and I encourage people to buy it.
Yeah.
I think I put the Massive Bookshop link, and if folks aren't familiar with Massive, they do use they call it anti-profit model, and so they use the money that they make from sales, whatever proceeds they use, to bail people out of jail. So
That's cool. I like
um
that.
yeah, so anyways, if you're looking for a place to buy it, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So anyways, Gemma, thank you. This is great as always. Look forward to having you on again. We have
Yeah.
to do another movie, we have to do an album,
Yeah.
so you know.
Yeah, we
um
do. Yeah.
yeah, so all right. So everybody have, you know, if you celebrate the holidays, have a happy holidays. And I probably have one or two things that I'll put out before the end of the year, but this might actually, I don't know, might be the last live of the year. There might be one more, but we'll see. So anyway, thank you. And much appreciation to you, Gemma, for this
Yeah.
conversation. It
Thank
was
you for
great.
having me. And thank you,
Yeah,
audience.
absolutely. Well, we'd be nothing without the audience, right? We'd just be two people talking to
Yes.
each other.
Well, you know, that's good too.
Right on.